Welcome to the Kelly Patrick Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. In today's episode, I am joined by my favorite free market author and thinker within the libertarian world, Jorge Besada. Jorge, thank you so much for coming back on the show.
Hey, Kelly, thanks a lot for having me again. You know,
I do mean it. I think you're a very thoughtful, um, articulate thinker when it comes to some of the most important topics out there. So I appreciate you delivering those messages in what I would describe as a productive way.
no, thanks. Yeah, and I do think I am good at doing this. I mean, but I got very lucky, right? I stumbled upon this guy here, Ludwig von Mises. I got a bust of him there, and I have a few quotes. I owe a lot of thanks to my friend Ted Chang, who introduced me to all this stuff. So I got to give him credit. So
Ted Chang?
Ted Chang, yeah, it's a friend of mine that introduced me to Hayek and all these things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very cool.
We all have
Yeah,
our story, right?
you do that when I say Jorge's always talking about these fallacies that we fall for. And you say, no, they're not my ideas. And you credit the people that you got them from. So I think that's a good way to be.
Yeah. Yeah. So what we're gonna do here. So I got a little title. We're gonna talk about a lot of things, right? So we're just gonna overcome fallacies, right? Overcoming imperialist, socialist, anti-Semitic, and Zionist fallacies, right? And in order to overcome these fallacies, we need an understanding, sort of like how the world works. And that's where these Austrian school economist guys, really come in. And, you and me and all of us in the American libertarian scene, we keep hearing about these guys and so on. So I'm going to basically give a little overview, some good quotes, a little overview of what are some of these guys' main ideas. And that provides the framework for understanding the world. And even Mises, I remember one of his quotes. He says, history can only be interpreted based on the correct theories. Right? If you don't really understand how society works, like the Marxists, they got their, class analysis, the good guys, bad guys. If you don't have the right ideas, you're going to misinterpret history. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Austrians, a little bit of some of their key ideas, and then we're going to look to see how mankind fooled himself into all the bad ideas. The imperialism, the racism, the slavery, the socialism, and then the Jew-Gentile stuff. So I just got a bunch of slides here. So jump in with any questions or whatever comments you want to make. And so again, what is the Austrian School of Economics? Those guys are like, just like Galileo is a key person, right? He explained how that the earth goes around the sun and that kind of stuff. So the Austrians are the same way. These men, it takes time for great thinkers to spread their ideas. So this Austrian School of Economics guys that I'll talk about, Mises, Menger, Hayek, that were so popular in the libertarian world, where really civilization is going through growing pains. It's just about getting their ideas out there. So that's what I'm going to try to summarize, a little bit. So I did write a little article called Austrian Economists Make the Superhero Needed to Overcome Our Myths. And that was just like, I grew up watching some of those cartoons, like they come together and they fight. So anyway, those are the faces there. But so I do want to start with some key quotes from some of these men, that really set the stage for how they see the world and how we want to understand things. And so one of these guys, so one of these main thinkers, right? His name is Ludwig von Mises, right? So since this man understood how the whole world works, they were all about educating people so that they could overcome the fallacies. This naive thing that we're just going to divide the world between some guys who are good and evil, that is not really how they see things. This man understood all the fallacies, right? So I got some key quotes that we really got to deal with, right? So this was one of my favorites. It is ideas that group men into fighting factions, that press the weapons into their hands, and that determine against whom and for whom the weapons shall be used. It is they alone and not arms that, in the last analysis, turn the scales, right? We want to understand the ideas instead of just naively saying, okay, well, you guys are the bad guys and so on. So another wonderful very important, another very key quote from Mises. Again, we have to focus on the problems, right? Mises says the problems involved are purely intellectual and must be dealt with as such via reason, logic, education. It is disastrous to shift them to the moral sphere and to dispose of supporters of opposite ideologies by calling them villains. This rigid dogmatism peculiar to sometimes, religious groups and Marxism results only in irreconcilable conflict. It condemns beforehand all dissenters as evildoers. It calls into question their good faith. It asks them to surrender unconditionally. No social cooperation is possible where such an attitude prevails. No better is the propensity, very popular nowadays, to brand supporters of opposite ideologies as lunatics.
Mm.
That's wonderful. If we have differences, whether it's Zionism or anti-Zionism, whether it's how the economy should function, whether it's the socialism or capitalism, whether you think the white man in imperialism should manage the whole world because they're the ones that they think they're all that, we have to make everything about the ideas. And just 90% of political discussions always end up in you're either evil or you're stupid. And in one paragraph, one paragraph in a sentence, Mises does away with both of those fallacies. So that's another key quote, setting the stage for the ethos of the Austrian school. And I just really wanted to include it. Another one, very important, Mises again, neither as judges allotting praise and blame, nor as avengers seeking out the guilty should we face the past. We seek truth, not guilt. We want to know how things came about to understand them, not to issue condemnations. Again, very sympathetic, very much about understanding, and we desperately need this for the Middle East chaos. We're not getting out of this mess by just saying that the Jews are evil or the Muslims are evil. Again, this sets the stage for what these men were about. Another one, history should teach us to recognize causes and to understand driving forces. And when we understand everything, we will forgive everything. Very, very profound. That's the ethos.
Would a critic say you sound a little bit like a hippie and not naive to say? Could you back it up on that one? Could you go back?
Oh, yeah.
Would a critic say, when we understand everything, we will forgive everything? Does that not sound a little Pollyanna?
It does. It does. But, these men, they were like profound. They're like, we have the power to understand everything. And there's so many quotes, I can't include them in there. But Mises is like, look, the best we can do is reason, and we have to keep pushing, testing old ideas, and we have to believe that we can understand and educate the immense majority. That's another quote I don't have in here. Because, if we do not believe that we can convince people as to how to reach a better world, then we will not even have enough people that are willing to try. And then we're doomed. And that's another quote. I don't remember it by heart, but it's another Mises quote, so that is, and you'll see, the ethos, these men were, that's why these men saved civilization. So it is true. It's a little idealistic, but where would we be if we didn't have these idealistic people who sometimes...
Tribalism.
Yeah, we'd be surrounded with tribalism, and we need these people that really believe that we can make things better.
We are kind of surrounded by tribalism.
Oh, yeah, especially now. Oh, boy. We'll get into that.
Sure.
So another one, I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to read the bottom half of this one. This is Friedrich Hayek. And he says, I am indeed profoundly convinced that there is much less difference between us and our opponents on the ultimate values to be achieved than is commonly believed. And that the differences between us are chiefly intellectual differences. We at least believe that we have attained an understanding of the forces which have shaped civilization, which our opponents lack. Yet, if we have not yet convinced them, the reason must be that our arguments are not yet quite good enough, that we have not yet made explicit some of the foundations on which our conclusions rest. Our chief task, therefore, must still be to improve the arguments on which our case for a free society rests. So Hayek is again very much like, look, if we haven't succeeded, we just have to do better. We can't assume that the people that we're arguing against, whether they're Zionist or Socialist, that they're just malicious, that they want something else. No, we all want the same thing. But everybody has their ways of going about it. The Zionists believe that to overcome anti-Semitism, we all want less anti-Semitism, right? We want Jews to be treated well. The Zionists believe that, creating their own state is what they think will work. I believe that's a mistake, right? And the Socialists believe that via their central planning, they can get it to. So Hayek is just making the point, right? That it's all about intellectual stuff. Okay, so that's almost one of the last ones of setting the stage, for understanding these fallacies. And and this is another one here. These are two other very key quotes from Hayek, right? So when it comes to socialism, you have ideologues that inadvertently fool themselves and the masses into horrible ideas. That's what socialism was. If you read biographies of Lenin, of Marx, and Trotsky and these guys, you're not going to see that these guys were just some power-hungry monsters that just wanted to screw everyone.
Sure.
No,
Yeah.
exactly. They were ideologues, and they fooled the masses with the best of intentions into total chaos. So these are two key Hayek quotes that, again, set the stage for how profound these men were. So Hayek says, it is necessary to realize that the sources of many of the most harmful agents in this world are often not evil men, but high-minded idealists. And that in particular, the foundations of totalitarian barbarism have been laid by honorable and well-meaning scholars who never recognized the offspring they produced. Right?
Certainly applies to Marx.
Yeah, it applies to Marx. And when you look at the history of Zionism, it applies to Zionism as well. A lot of very smart people thought that, yeah, this is the way we're going to overcome anti-Semitism. And from my perspective, they led to a total calamity. And we'll get to that later. So here's another Hayek quote. This is the last one, I promise here.
That's all right. This is good stuff. Nerding out on the libertarian stuff is not a bad thing.
Good. So there's another one. It's so applicable to what we're dealing with, right? Hayek says, most people are still unwilling to face the most alarming lesson of modern history, that the greatest crimes of our times have been committed by governments that had the enthusiastic support of millions of people who were guided by moral impulses. It is simply not true that Hitler, Mussolini, Lenin, or Stalin appealed only to the worst instincts of their people. They also appeal to some of the feelings which also dominate contemporary democracies. Right? And this is Hayek's most alarming lesson of modern history. I mean, and this is what we're seeing right now, at least from my perspective, right? The Zionists believe that, oh yeah, let's have another war against Iran. Let's have another war in Gaza. Let's do all this stuff. Let's expel these people. Let's keep increasing military spending. The Russians are evil. The Chinese are evil. With the best of intentions, people are fooling themselves into a total warmongering disaster, which, again, I believe Zionism is inadvertently causing. So, okay, I think that's the last one of just the quotes of these men setting the stage for what, you know, well, I got a short one here. I can't read the first sentence. Perhaps the fact that we have seen millions voting themselves into complete dependence on a tyrant has made our generation understand that to choose one's government is not necessarily to secure freedom.
To choose one's government is not necessarily to secure freedom.
Yeah, we have a democracy, but if the masses are clueless, they vote for socialism.
Sure.
I mean, all the chaos we have right now is really the result of the ignorance of the masses. Everybody's going along with what Trump is doing. If we had a population of just an extra 3 million Kellys or Jorges, and we would just not pay our taxes in day one, and this thing would be over, right? But the masses go along with Trump, with all the bombing and all the nonsense. So I thought it was, it's another nice quote. But
sure, I like it.
Okay. Now, these are a couple of other key quotes. So remember, we're trying to overcome disastrous ideologies, imperialism, socialism, right? So whenever people try to bring change, it's very dangerous. Look what's happening right now to Tucker Carlson. Right? The mob is going after him. So this quote from Niccolo Machiavelli, famous author of The Prince, look how incredible this quote is. He says, "It ought to be remembered there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. Because the innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under the old conditions and lukewarm defenders in those who may do well in the new." Right? We're trying to overcome it would have been difficult to try to overcome communism if you're in the Soviet Union. Very difficult, right?
Sure.
Because everybody who's part of the bureaucracy, living good, they'll denounce you as a traitor, you're evildoer. And what we're dealing right now with Zionism, look what Tucker is doing. And we see Ted Cruz, all the idiotic politicians, fine, all of those guys are part of the bureaucracy. So everyone who's trying to make a difference is perilous, right? And we're dealing with that right now. We're about to go to jail.
You and I are, you think?
Oh, yeah, we'll see. We'll see.
I
Okay,
certainly hope not.
yeah, yeah. Uh, these are a quick here. People will forgive you for being wrong, but they will never forgive you for being right, especially if events prove you right while proving others wrong. I couldn't read the top. You could see it, right? This is very.
I have the thing in the way too, actually.
Oh, okay, okay, okay.
I don't know if that's in
Oh
the
no.
image though. I don't know if that's for the people who are watching.
Well, yeah, yeah, yeah. I found it. I found it with that. So people will forgive you for being wrong, but they will never forgive you for being right, especially if events prove you right while proving them wrong. Right? It's very
Okay.
hard to change people's minds. Right?
It really is.
It really
Even
is.
if it's just seemingly very obvious.
Yeah, yeah. The next one is very relevant again to what we're dealing with, right? It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it.
Wow, that's a strong one. That
Upton
applies
Sinclair.
to a lot of situations.
Oh yeah. I mean, and again, once again, let's think about the Soviet Union. Everybody's working for the government. How are you going to tell people that the new order means that they're going to lose their jobs? It's the same thing right now with Zionism. We'll talk about that later. The United States already spent $1.5 trillion in military spending. How much of that money goes to pay for people's salaries, to all the think tanks, to APAC, to all these things? The entire social order is dependent on the current ideology. And so anyway, that's another great quote. Another short one very quickly. It is human nature that repeats itself, not history. It's a cute one. We won't
Okay.
get too much into that one. And Mises, again, most of the tyrants, despots, and dictators are sincerely convinced that their rule is beneficial for the people, that theirs is government for the people.
Wow,
Right?
that's a difficult one to really wrap your head around and understand. If you're critical of the state of Israel, you say is Benjamin Netanyahu, you know, but to really truly put yourself into his shoes and to think about, where he came from and his brother being killed at a relatively young age and the actual obstacles he's faced in his life. Yeah, that makes sense. Mises does seem to take the cake for the brilliance.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, Trump, Lenin, every dictator thought that he was bringing about the great utopia.
Do you think even like Stalin
Oh, sure. I think even Stalin thought that he was.
got to crack an egg? What is it, to make an omelet? You got to crack an egg. We'll
I
kill
think
some
so, yeah.
people, starve some people. No big deal. It's
Yeah,
for
I
the
mean,
great. It's for the greater good.
exactly. You're starving out the people who are getting in the way of the great utopia. I mean, these days, the way things are going, how many Zionists are okay with anti-Zionists getting bombed, losing their job, getting doxxed? It's fine. You're getting rid of the terrorist, the sympathizers for the terrorist.
And it's important to try to not fall into those same fallacies the other way, of course, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's why we got those Mises quotes. We want
That's why we're having this
understanding.
episode.
Yeah, yeah. And I got another one down there. The last one down there. There is by American philosopher Daniel Dennett. He says, "There's simply no polite way to tell people they've dedicated their lives to an illusion." Think about something like communism, right? You have so many intellectuals and people who spend their entire lives into what is ultimately a disastrous idea. To me, the same thing happens with Zionism. You've devoted your entire life to something that can only bring about, chaos. So
Or
it's
you have
another
your
great.
friend who's devoted his life to a career in the military,
Yeah,
and he doesn't like it when you criticize the 1.5 trillion annual budget for the military. I mean, how many of these quotes apply to that guy? His
yeah, yeah,
salary is tied up into it, his livelihood, his family, probably so many members of his family. That's what they've devoted their lives to.
yeah. His own sense of I'm a great person. I'm sacrificing, for society. And again, it's not malice, but in reality,
It's not
90
malice. It's not malice.
yeah 95% of military spending is just pure consumption that could be growing society and doing all kinds of other things. And yeah, it's very tricky. All right, I think I'm done with the quotes. Okay, so
Okay.
now I'll just get back the two of us here. So now I'm gonna I'm going to give a little overview, just a very, like a 5-minute overview of the Austrian School of Economics, how they kind of like see things, right? And I talk a little bit about this in that article that I have there. So now, if you think, we all need wealth, right? Everything needs wealth to survive, right? So the easiest way that you can get wealth is just through predation, right? You take the wealth from someone else, you kill the animal, right? Even the animal kingdom knows that. Animals know that to be a predator, you take something, right? So you use force and violence. But now, the minute you remove force and violence, right? If you're smart to do that, okay? Then you have the tradition of private property, right? You have private property, and if there is no force and violence, you have no choice but to trade your private property, right? Most of us end up trading our labor, right? If you sell apples or oranges, fine. You make apples and oranges and you trade them for the things that you need. But most people don't realize we trade our labor. Every day, if you're a computer programmer for Microsoft, you trade an hour of computer programmer services with Microsoft, right? And then in exchange for that, you get money.
Mm-hmm.
But you're producing an exchange, right? Now, that emerges from private property. The minute you have private property and you cannot steal or beat up someone else, exchange and trade emerges from private property, right? It's easy, right? Now, so from freedom to trade inadvertently turns the entire planet into a global supercomputer, where every company, right, is motivated to come up with a better idea, right? And they also have to copy the ideas of competitors. Right? Like, I don't know who came up with power door locks and power windows. The example I like to use, I'll just assume it was a Honda engineer working in Tokyo, right? So Honda is a company, it's a private sector company. It can't coerce anyone. It always has to come up with a better idea or to copy the ideas of competitors. So they came up with a power door locks idea and power windows. So they put it in their cars, right? Now, what happens? BMW, Chevy, Audi, every other auto manufacturer has to copy the power door locks idea. Right?
Sure.
And why is it that in the private sector, every private sector order has to innovate or copy the innovations of others? They have to do it because of the freedom of the consumer, right? It is my freedom as a consumer to only trade my private property for what I calculate to be best that motivates everyone in our role as producers to discover how to do the best. And we can only do the best in one of two ways. Again, we either innovate something better or we copy the existing innovations of others. So, right, so from private property emerges the freedom to trade, and from freedom to trade emerges economic competition, right, which inadvertently turns mankind into a global supercomputer that is constantly coming up with superior information and spreading it throughout the entire world. Right? Continuously reordering mankind, right? The power door locks idea. It helps to look at it from Google Maps, right? Imagine you're up on Google Maps and you can see the knowledge arising here and spreading over there and reordering society, right? And so now, this is very important. This process of what Hayek would call competitive knowledge discovery, right? Because that's how you discover and you spread the information through competition, competitive knowledge discovery. This process only works in the private sector, right? It is only the private sector where everyone is motivated to innovate, and you have to copy the innovations of others. You can't just sit back, right? This doesn't happen in the government, right? The government does not get its wealth by doing as good as competitors. The government gets the wealth that it needs to consume, because we all have to consume, by taxation, by direct taxation.
Goes right back to the very beginning thing you mentioned, where it's just by force, by taking.
Yes, exactly, right. So the government does not have to innovate. It does not have to copy innovations. And another very key thing is that everything in the private sector, right, is in a constant, this is very important, is in a constant cycle of production of wealth that increases the economic pie. So production is sales revenue, right? Or every time you work an hour for Microsoft or whatever you do, you're producing your labor, right? So production increases the economic pie, right? And then you have consumption. Production is sales revenue. Consumption is how much wealth you have to consume in order to produce something, right? If you're going to produce a skyscraper, you need to consume. You need to consume all the food and energy that hundreds of men are going to have to consume for months or years that it takes to build a skyscraper. You need to consume the materials, the bricks, the concrete, the wires, right? So there's a never-ending cycle of production, which increases the world's economic pie, and consumption that decreases the economic pie. And if you produce more than you consume, you're profitable, right? That's what a profit is. A profit just means that you have produced more than what you had to consume, right? So the private sector, every businessman, the entire private sector is always ordered. There's always economic calculation. The businessman is always making sure that he can produce more than he consumes. The individual produces more than he consumes. If you work and you're making $4,000 a month, you can consume up to $4,000 a month, right? You can't consume more than you produce. I mean,
Certainly,
you can go in debt.
Certainly can't consume more. I mean, I guess you could go into debt, which is a big part of our society today.
Of course, you can go into debt, but then obviously you got to pay the debt eventually and so on. But the point I want to make is that the private sector is always ordered using economic calculation, right? Where every brain is always looking to increase production, to increase profitability, and so on. So again, this is something else that the government doesn't do, right? The government just consumes wealth, and then it gives you, like public education in New York City is a perfect example. Right now, the per pupil cost in New York City per student, K through 12, is $35,000.
Wow.
It taxes people and it consumes $35,000 to educate a kid from K through 12. I mean, what are they learning compared to all the wealth that you're consuming?
$35,000 a year.
Yeah, $35,000 per year.
Wow.
So what happens is that the government, since the government cannot possibly order itself in a manner where it produces more than it consumes, it always ends up shrinking the economic pie. So now, if you try communism, socialism, where you abolish the private sector, right? Now, there is no competition, there is no motivation to learn or to copy the innovations of others, and there is no way to know that what you are producing produces more than what you have to consume to create it. So you end up just consuming, and you have all the famines that happen in the Soviet Union, China, and all that bullshit. So this is a little example of just the key basic economics, and what I just tried to explain is very Hayekian, because Hayek had a big focus on information. So, which I think is one of the best ways to get the people to understand, that it's really the key. Everything comes down to information. How do we order our actions in the way that have the best technology, where we're doing the most, where we have, the best? It all comes down to information. How do you discover the best information? Through competition. And competition emerges from the freedom to trade, which itself emerges from private property. So once you really understand all those links, you realize, wait a minute, all we need is private property. Yeah. So if we respect private property and we allow the people to have as much freedom and to keep as much of their wealth as possible, we will have maximum economic competition, the best spread of ideas and information. Then this is very important too. The more wealth is produced, the more wealth has to be offered in exchange for labor, right? If you have two companies and they're both getting rich, they have to compete against each other for labor. So that is what drives, our salaries up. You only have to worry about production. If you're being more productive, don't worry. The wealth will go to the employees. That's why, if you go to Microsoft or a city like Bellevue, where you have Microsoft, Amazon, all these big companies, they can't pay a programmer $5 an hour. If Microsoft wants to pay a programmer $5 an hour, Amazon will say, oh my God, I'm going to hire you for $30 an hour, right? So it's really production and competition between wealth producers that keeps driving, the salary of like people, So anyway, that was a very quick overview from private property, the freedom to trade, then we get economic competition, and that is what keeps, reordering society. So now very quickly, let's look at history very quickly, looked at from an Austrian economics perspective. So if we look at society, say in the 1600s, right? At some point in Europe, we got some key innovations like the printing press, and eventually we got the steam engine, right? And things like the steam engine now really increased the rate at which you could produce wealth. That makes sense, right? Once you have a steam engine, when production is really just a transformation of matter, right? You're taking natural resources and you're transforming them to create stuff. So once you have engines and so on, now you can really increase the rate of production. But what happens? You started getting factories, right? And factories are things that require labor and lots of people and all kinds of things. So those things only really exist in cities, right? So cities where the factories started growing, because they had factories and various entrepreneurs coming up, before you could make one garment every week. But now when you have a factory, you can create 300, per person. So the factories started getting very productive in the cities, right? So that means that the factories now, they have to compete against each other for labor, right? So the wages in the cities are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So now we start seeing a change in the evolution of society. In the 1600s, most people were living in tiny, self-sufficient towns, right? Everybody was a farmer in 1960, 95% of the population. But now you start
in 1690.
Sorry, in 1690, in the
That's
16th
right.
century, 1700s. By the 1800s, now you start getting factories everywhere. Now people are moving to the cities, right? And once people start moving to the cities, I mean, again, you have more people. It becomes easier to have competition. If you have an idea, now you can quickly hire people to do your company or your idea. If you have little towns dispersed by hundreds of miles away, how are you going to spread information?
Mm.
So when you have cities with millions of people, competitive knowledge discovery and competition is always now coming up with an idea. This guy makes a factory a little better. This guy discovers a chemical process that can make things better. Then competition spreads the information. Everybody's producing more. Now you start getting rubber, tires, engines, better engines, planes, all kinds of stuff. So it's very important to realize that this happens in the cities, right? And the cities are becoming more productive. The salaries are rising. People are leaving the farms and going back into the cities and all that stuff. So you start getting technology, increases in production, big differences in wealth. And very important, you start getting a complexity that fools people, right? Cities are getting so complex. You're starting to get some differences between wealth, between the people that have a lot and those that have less. And now you start birthing before I get into that. So, you start seeing this stuff happen, right? So this is capitalism, right? It's capitalism. Now, very important, economic competition also shapes, remember, economic competition discovers and spreads superior information, right? But what are morals? Morals are also superior information. So Hayek has a wonderful quote. For example, so it's hardworking, courteous people and workers that treat others with respect in a manner that maximizes cooperation and production and profitability, regardless of age, sex, religion, etc. That, thanks to competition, motivates everyone else to be likewise, right? So Hayek writes, he says, competition is, after all, always a process in which a small number makes it necessary for larger numbers to do what they do not like, be it to work harder, to change habits, or to devote a degree of attention, continuous application, or regularity to their work, without competition would not be needed, right? We all have to treat everyone with respect and work hard, because if not, they fire our ass and they hire someone.
Or they refuse to do business with you or purchase from you or sell to
Exactly.
you or...
Exactly. So it's very important to realize, because a lot of people will tell you, oh, in order to have a good culture, you need to coerce this rule, or you need to do this, or everybody has to follow this, or whatever. No. If you have freedom, it'll naturally, little by little, create incentives where you have a civilized population. So this was happening. So all this was happening. People moving to the factories. There was freedom. People were working. They wanted to have the latest suits. They wanted to dress nice. And that culture was spreading throughout the entire world. In the year 1900, if you went to Tokyo, Japan, most people were wearing a business suit, right? If you went to Paris, you would find somebody with a business suit, because dressing in a business-like fashion, it meant I'm a somebody. I am responsible. I have a company. If I have wealth, it's because I am a productive person. Wealth was a way to show, oh, look, this is a successful person. You can only get rich if you were hardworking, if you treated others with respect. So this culture of capitalism was also spreading, right? So I have explained a little bit of the history based on, this is key now. This is one of the major insights of the Austrians, okay, what I'm about to tell you, okay? And this comes from the founder of the Austrian school, Karl Menger. So everything that we have talked about right now, from private property, you get freedom to trade, economic competition, spreading knowledge through society, and the evolution of all this complexity. The key thing that Karl Menger, one of his insights, is that this wonderful mechanism that creates capitalism, nobody invented it, right? So here's a little analogy. If you look at the human body is the result of the actions of trillions of cells, right? We have respiratory, digestive, nervous systems, right? It's obvious that the cells act and they cause all these things to happen. It would be an absurdity to say that the cells designed all of these mechanisms, right? Whether you believe in evolution or you believe a certain time ago God said, okay, fine, this is the way things are going to work. The important thing is, like, it's the cells that do the acting, but they did not design the mechanism, right? Well, Karl Menger helped us understand that the exact same thing happens with the functioning of society and other things. Language is another key example. Language is obviously the result of human beings, right? Human beings created language. But no smart caveman 200,000 years ago sat down one day and said, I'm going to invent language so we can all talk a little better, we can hunt a little better, we can do things, right? That's obvious, right?
Sure.
So language is something that is the result of the actions of people, but was not designed by people. And Karl Menger really focused on this, society, and the way private property, economic competition, the legal system, how all of these things come together to create what Karl Menger referred to as the social organism. They are the result, they evolve through unintended results of historical development. They were not designed, right? And this is key for understanding. You see, since society is the result of a blind process that little by little man stumbled upon it, that helps us understand why people are so clueless and they easily fall for stupid ideas like communism. If capitalism had been designed, by now everybody would have a little book that says, well, this is the way we should have society. We should privatize as much as possible, right? Because we can have competition and always discover the best ideas and all that. And we would already have it, right? But it wasn't. Am I making sense?
Makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. It's all intertwined.
Good. So this is one of the key insights of Karl Menger, right? So we talked a little bit about competition, how it rises from private property. We talked a little bit about the modern history of modern capitalism, how key inventions happen, people were moving to the cities, and then all this complexity happens. So now let us look at the fallacies of imperialism, right? So what happened? This process, the steam engine, modern capitalism evolved. It quickly grew first in Europe, where we had the white man, right? And because suddenly the white man found himself with huge advances in technology compared to non-whites, right? And the white man did not understand capitalism. Remember, the white man did not design capitalism. The white man
is just a cell.
He was like a cell. He had respect for private property, and little by little, all these wonderful things came about, but nobody really knew. So the white man finds himself, oh, look, since I'm doing so much better than everyone else, it's obviously because there's something in my whiteness. There's something in my race, right? Or God chose me to be, the great, leader of all this. That was also a popular fallacy. A lot of people thought, well, God chose us, to be the great, planners and all that. So that leads me to this next quote I want to read you here. Let me just backtrack for a second. So remember, Karl Marx writes in his famous little book, The Communist Manifesto, the theory of the communist may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property, abolition of the family.
That's so wild.
That's crazy.
And to put yourself into the shoes of them and try to think how good, well-intentioned they were when you read what Engels and Marx wrote about, specifically about disintegrating the family.
Oh yeah, the
It's
family.
difficult to put yourself in those shoes.
But they bought into it, and it's easy to. I mean, we'll get into it later as well. But also, the socialists were hardcore atheists. So by getting rid of God and all of our existing morality, that's how they can suddenly say, "Oh, we can just abolish the family."
They didn't think they were getting rid of morality, though, did they?
Oh no, existing morality.
Okay.
They thought that they could just socially engineer everything and discard, what worked in the past. Anyway, so that was a little quote there. Oh, I'll throw this in there now. But when the Bolsheviks, when this bad idea was spreading through Russia everywhere, right? Because this bad idea, Lenin, at the end of the First World War, he has this revolution in Russia, and then they got the Red Army, and the Red Army is spreading towards Austria. The ideology is spreading everywhere. And I just want to throw this one quote because few people have any idea that Ludwig von Mises not only was an incredible economist, he almost single-handedly saved civilization, because the Bolsheviks, Soviet ideology, was about to spread into Austria. But Mises himself, he went to the leading Austrian politicians, and he managed to go to their house and sit down with them and persuade them against joining the Soviet Union. One man, right? And Mises writes, "I knew what was at stake. Bolshevism would lead Vienna to starvation and terror within a few days. Plundering hordes would take to the streets, and a second bloodbath would destroy what was left of Viennese culture. The most important task I undertook was the forestalling of a Bolshevist takeover. The fact that events did not lead to such a regime in Vienna was my success and mine alone."
Wow.
That's badass.
I'd say so, yes.
That's badass.
To recognize the danger of
the messed up ideology.
Yes.
And to say, I got to do it. He could have just left the country. He could have sat back and said, "Oh, the Bolsheviks are evil, or something." But he said, no. There's fallacies here. I got to educate these politicians and prevent them from joining, the Bolsheviks.
Wow. So that was shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917?
Yeah, I think that happened. Yeah, the Bolshevik Revolution started in 1917, but I think that Mises did that in 1919.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah. One second. I got another quote here, but I got the order messed up. 1 second. Yeah. Okay. Should be coming up here.
I see it. You want me to read it?
No, this one.
Oh, no. Yeah.
Okay. So let me get back to the imperialism, right? So the white man finds himself with all this technology, right? And so this is a good example. I'm going to read the second half of this quote. So U.S. Senator Albert Beveridge, in the year 1900, he gives us a perfect example of how the white ruling class saw things at the time. So he says, "God has not been preparing the English-speaking and Teutonic peoples for 1,000 years for nothing but vain and idle self-contemplation and self-admiration. No, he has made us master organizers of the world to establish a system where chaos reigns. He has given us the spirit of the spirit of progress to overwhelm the forces of reaction throughout the earth. He has made us adept in government that we may administer government among savage and senile peoples. Were it not for such a force as this, the world would relapse into barbarism and night. And of all our race, he has marked the American people as his chosen nation to finally lead the regeneration of the world. This is the divine mission of America, and he holds for us all the profit, all the glory, all the happiness possible. To man, we are trustees of the world's progress, guardians of its righteous peace." Right?
Doesn't sound so good.
Yeah.
In hindsight, I guess. Maybe at the time it did.
Of course, but this is a great example. We want to understand how people fool themselves into such what today should be seen as absurd ideas. But it's understandable, right? This man is
He and I were both born in the state of Ohio.
Oh, well,
So
maybe you're related.
Similarities with Albert
Yeah.
Beveridge.
So that's a great quote to show the mindset of the fallacies at the time, right? Yeah. Now, whoops. Anyways, this is all a little like, oh no, there's a reason why I got the order messed up here. Sorry about that. Whoops. Okay, so anyway, that's the mindset at the time. But now, so how do we overcome this imperialism, right? Through freedom, right? Through freedom. What was happening in the early 1900s, it is true that the white man had all the technology and all these things, but what happened? Blacks in Africa, Asians were obviously upset because you got the white man colonizing you, taking away your land, bossing you around, right? And for example, the Chinese, they closed themselves to the white man, right? They didn't want to deal with these people because, whatever, these people are kicking our ass or whatever, for a little while. But the Japanese, I wanted to throw that in there. The Japanese during the Meiji Reformation, or like sometime in the 1800s, they said, wait a minute, we're going to learn from these people. We're upset that these guys are kicking our ass and they got all this technology, but we're going to learn from these people. We're going to read their books. We're going to see who their greatest thinkers are, and we're going to see what the hell is going on here. So I just really want to throw it in there. So the Japanese, when they started looking to see where the best authors and where the greatest intellectuals were in the English-speaking world, they stumbled upon a very important intellectual. They stumbled upon a man. His name is Herbert Spencer. Okay? And so Herbert Spencer, one second. I got to say a few things about him. So, the non-whites, were very upset. So Herbert Spencer quickly he was one of the most influential thinkers among the Japanese. And he was one of the leading thinkers of the late 1800s. Okay? Herbert Spencer was a personal acquaintance of someone like Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin once wrote to Spencer and told him, everyone with eyes to see and ears to hear ought to bow their knee to you, and I for one do. And he also referred to Spencer as 20 times my superior. I mean, coming from Darwin, who's a major intellectual, that's big.
You consider yourself a secular Darwinian?
I think that's okay.
Is that an accurate description?
It's an accurate description.
Okay.
And so Murray Rothbard, right, Mr. Libertarian. I mean, it doesn't get more libertarian than Rothbard. Murray Rothbard said, he writes, Spencer, in short, more than any other figure, was our Marx. That's big.
Sure.
Right? That's big. Coming from Rothbard. He says,
more so than Menger?
Well, I don't want to deviate too much, but
sorry.
No. But I mean, Menger. I mean, maybe Rothbard made a mistake. He should have said Menger.
Okay, maybe.
But Spencer is right up there.
Okay.
So Rothbard continues he says, at the height of his career in the middle and late 19th century, Spencer was acknowledged to be the greatest intellectual figure of his age, read and held widely by scientists, intellectuals, and the general people alike. So some Japanese leaders, at the time, they were in close correspondence with Spencer, as they even created their own laws and constitutions. Okay? So Herbert Spencer was a big-time capitalist, and he wrote a very important essay, like in the late 1800s, an essay called The Coming Slavery, where he predicted that socialism was going to enslave mankind. So he was one of the people who knew that socialism, that the masses were falling for all of this statism, for the militarism, for all the bullshit. So he did a great job. And the last thing I'll mention is that there's a Japanese scholar. He wrote an essay called Herbert Spencer in Early Meiji Japan, where he says, quote, Spencer has been called the most widely read and possibly the most influential Western social and political thinker in Japan during the 1880s. Between 1877 and 1900, at least 32 translations and one critical study of Spencer's works were published. Besides many articles in leading journals and magazines, the writings of John Stuart Mill rank next in popularity. Other Western thinkers like Rousseau, Montesquieu, Huxley, Darwin, Bentham, and all these other guys received much less public attention. So the point I want to make is that, Herbert Spencer, who was very much for freedom and capitalism and all that, became a top intellectual in Japan. So this helped the Japanese adopt private property enterprise, and eventually capitalism. You get it?
Sure.
They stumble upon Spencer, and they stumble upon capitalism first. So now they had a head start in capitalism. So since they had a head start, that is what allowed the Japanese to become the major power in Asia.
Wow.
Right? So in the first Sino-Japanese war between the Chinese and the Japanese crushed the Chinese, for control of South Korea. That's why South Korea for a long time was controlled by the Japanese, leading to a lot of bad blood. And then this has a lot to do with the fall of imperialism. Then in 1904 and 1905, it was the first time that an Asiatic power, the Japanese, they crushed the Russians in a naval battle, right? So this was the first time a non-white power would crush, the whites. So it dealt a massive blow to racist imperialist ideology.
Interesting.
Right. So then you just have trade, right? You have Japanese and people interacting with each other, companies hiring people all over the world, people interacting with each other. Little by little, you ended up destroying the imperialist attitude. Right. So, but again, the key thing is the white man inadvertently stumbled upon capitalism that took him to prominence, and the white man fooled himself into thinking that it was his blood, or God chose me to be great leaders, but those were fallacies, right?
When you use the word capitalism, I heard, and I don't know if this is accurate, but I heard someone say at some point that the term capitalism was created by socialists.
I think so. I don't know the story perfectly, but I think I know what you mean. Yeah, because
when you say capitalism, you mean voluntary trade.
Yes. Yeah, voluntary trade. It means that it's the private sector. We got the private sector. I mean, I'm not gonna complicate matters by talking about.
No, I get it. I think I understand. I do think it's interesting though, because sometimes I listen through the lens of what a critic would maybe be saying. Is capitalism? Look at capitalism. America right now is capitalist, and Jorge is saying this is so great.
Yeah, because they don't understand. I mean,
Sure.
It's true that just really shows how far we are from getting where we need to be. Where even the terms, people don't even understand. That's how much we have to educate.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, so that was the temporary rise of imperialist attitudes and their decline, and then we already talked a little bit about socialism, right? The social order got very complex, right? Then the fallacies of central planning, because people are thinking, wait a minute. Wouldn't it be better if instead of having 20 different companies and CEOs getting rich, we just had the government and the experts run one thing, and then we could just share the profits equally? And then we could standardize. Why have 20 different cars with 20 different parts, right? Why not just standardize? Now, people don't realize that the differences between auto manufacturers, that's competition. That's one car trying something different and then motivating the spread of ideas to other people. But people don't understand that. They only see, some guy having a little bit more wealth, right? And the communists thought that making a profit out of labor was immoral, right? But then remember, a profit is just more production than consumption. So then they made it a criminal act to hire anyone. And
that screws the whole system up, I would say.
Yeah. So I got a quote here from Lenin, right? So kulaks in Russia, kulaks were just farmers that were big enough to hire laborers, pretty much, right? So the kulaks, if you're hiring a laborer and you're profiting off the laborer, you are a bad person, right? So Lenin says, you're a greedy exploiter, right? If you're hiring someone, you're making a profit, you're a greedy exploiter. So this is what Lenin says. Lenin says, quote, hang, and I mean hang publicly so that people see it. At least 100 kulaks, rich bastards, known bloodsuckers. Publish their names, seize all their grain. P.S. Find tougher people. If I remember
sorry?
that.
P.S. what?
P.S. Find tougher people.
Find tougher people.
Yeah. To be tough, we gotta go after the profiteers.
In his mind, like we discussed earlier, it was all for the greater good.
Exactly.
And so he's saying, this is what must be done. This is just necessary to right the injustices of the exploitative system that we're in.
Yeah, they fooled themselves. those Hayek quotes at the beginning, they fooled themselves into a disastrous idea. So let me see here. Okay, we're almost done with all this here. I put the wrong order here, but this is a nice quote. This is Ron Paul. He says, I stumbled upon Austrian Economics, when I was studying medicine at Duke University and came across a copy of Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. After devouring this, I was determined to read whatever I could find on what I thought was this new school of economic thought, especially the works of Mises. So again, it's important to realize that everything that's going on, Ron Paul, Thomas Massey, Rand Paul, whatever little we have left of great freedom defenders, it's all because of these people. And what's going on in Argentina with Javier Milei, it's because these people as well. Right? Okay. Okay. Now, something else very, very important. Okay. So it's important to see socialism, right? Not as like Lenin and some bad guys just getting together to screw everyone, right? It was an ideology that fooled a lot of people. So George Carlin, the famous comedian, right? A critic, you know him? He's he said, this is a very profound quote. George Carlin astutely mentioned, you don't need a formal conspiracy when interests converge. Right? Right? When a lot of people think alike, right? When they have a shared ideology and that ideology is spreading, sooner or later, people are going to find each other and they're going to then conspire to make the ideology come true. This will tie in later on to Zionism, right? Socialism began as an idea. Society was getting complex. People with good intentions wanted to make society better. Then somebody writes a book about it. The ideas are spreading, and little by little, you start getting little communist pockets, little communist revolutions here and there, and so on, until eventually you get a real revolution and you bring about the new ideology. Right? And so I mean, something else I'll quickly mention, like at the end of the First World War, Germany was in total chaos. And there were 3 communist revolutions inside Germany. And unfortunately, the 3 of them were led by Jews, by communist Jews. Rosa Luxemburg, Levin, and some other guy. And that gave the impression that it was led by the Jews, which it really wasn't. But anyway, I wanted to mention this quote because it's important that we, per Mises, that we understand the deeper reasons for why things happen without falling for some grandiose, nefarious conspiracy. Right? So that's a good little quote. And then a very important statistic. Okay? Just hear me out on this one here. So this is they did a research. So an average, they found that about 2%, right? 2%, 2 out of 100, 1 out of 50 scientists admitted to have fabricated, falsified, or modified data or results at least once. A serious form of misconduct by any standard, right? And up to 33% admitted other questionable practices, right? Right? So 1 out of 50 scientists will flat out lie for financial gain, money from the government, prestige, whatever, right? 1 out of 50. Also, in surveys asking about the behavior of colleagues, right? Not just you, because, for you to admit that you're corrupt, that takes a lot of balls, right? But to admit that other people have been cheating, you're more likely to get somebody to confess. So anyway, in surveys asking about the behavior of colleagues, admission rates were 14% for falsification and up to 72% for questionable research practices. So the point of bringing that up is that statistically, you're always going to find people who are willing to lie, to exaggerate, right? To spread what they consider to be in their self-interest or their ideology, right? So when you factor these things together, that's how it helps, grow ideologies without necessarily, somebody plotting the whole thing, right? Let me give you a final perfect example. Do you remember the Charlie Hebdo shooting in France? Some cartoonists, they drew the Prophet Muhammad, right? In France, some cartoonists drew the Prophet Muhammad, and they published these things, to ridicule Muslims or something like that. And that really pissed off some Muslims, and some Muslims went into the Charlie Hebdo office with machine guns or whatever, and they killed like 14 people.
Jeez.
Right? Now, is that the result of a conspiracy of Muslims from Riyadh, Saudi Arabia? No, right? Like statistically, there's going to be a percentage of people, right, that are willing to use force and do violence, right? You have what, 2 billion Muslims. If just 0.0001% of those Muslims are willing to commit violence, you're going to get violence, right? The point I want to make is that it's important to be aware of statistics, of incentives, right? That little by little motivate people to carry out an ideology without the ideology being plotted from the beginning by nefarious actors.
This ties back into the conspiracy conversation you had just a minute ago.
Right. So we do not want to make the mistake of saying that communism was a conspiracy by Marx and Lenin. And we do not want to make the mistake of saying that Zionism was just some evil conspiracy by the satanic Jews. Right? It's an ideology that little by little motivated more and more people to get together and carry it out. Right. So anyway, we got to fast forward here because, man. Okay. So now, we talked a little bit about the functioning of the market, how information spreads through competition, all that. So now we talked about imperialism, how that mistake spread. And we talked about how people fool themselves into communist bullshit, right? Big mistakes, right? And so now let's talk a little bit now about Jew-Gentile problems, right? Jew-Gentile misunderstandings, right? All the fallacies that happen here.
You mean that's not something that just happened this year?
Right. This only anti-Semites, want to look back at the past. So let's very quickly. So I'll just quickly run, through them, and we'll just say a few things about them. So one of the major fallacies is misunderstanding ethnic Jewish overrepresentation in finance and banking. Okay?
That's a big one.
It's a big one, right? We've all ran into that, right? A lot of people say, oh, the usurious Jews, they run the banks.
Every chair of the Federal Reserve ever until the current one, Jerome Powell, every chairman has been Jewish prior to Jerome Powell.
We'll get back to that in a second.
So, there's all sorts of, I don't want to say legitimacy to those fallacies, but there's all sorts of fodder there for those types of arguments.
Of course, yeah, that's
why they come from a place. They come from somewhere.
Yeah. So the thing about the Jews in finance and banking, that really comes. This is very important. The Islamic world and the Christian world, the Roman Catholic Church, which really ran, a lot of Europe for many centuries, they saw charging interest on loans as like very immoral. Right? So they prevented Muslims from charging interest and becoming financiers and bankers, essentially, and they prevented Christians from becoming financiers and bankers. So what happens? They make the Jews the only financiers and bankers. So inadvertently, I doubt they did it on purpose, they motivated the entire Western world to put all of their savings and all of their wealth with the Jews. So if you are going to motivate people and all the kings and all the people to put all their savings and all the wealth in the Jews, it makes sense they're going to have some additional power, right? So anyway,
and you cannot blame those. We're all self-interested, you know.
You cannot blame them.
I would have likely accepted it if there was a lucrative job within finance and banking in my city, whatever year I was born, 1,000 years ago, whenever it was, I would have likely worked in that industry also.
Of course. So here are some passages in the Quran where they really have strong prohibitions on money lending. So that they took usury that were forbidden, and they devoured man's substance wrongfully. We have prepared for those among them who reject faith a grievous punishment. So the Quran has strong passages telling you, that usury is bad, interest. Another quote, Allah will deprive usury of all blessing, but will give increase for deeds of charity, for he does not long love ungrateful and wicked creatures. So that's in the Quran, strong prohibitions on interest. Now, the New Testament, right? The New Testament is a little more friendly, right? I can't read the top here. Damn it. Maybe you can't read it either. Why then
didst thou not put money in a bank so that I, on my return, might have gotten it with interest?
Right.
But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back.
So the first quote implies that it's okay to have interest, right? Why didn't you put the money in the bank so you can get interest? So it's a passage from the Bible that is pro interest. But the second one tells you to lend without expecting anything back. So it's a statement that is very anti-interest, right? So that's the New Testament. But now let us look at the Old Testament. Let's look at how the Jews see these things. Unfortunately, let me see. It says, you may charge a foreigner interest, but not a brother Israelite. So the Jews say, oh, fine, you can charge somebody else who's not part of our little tribe, but not one of us. And another quote is, if you lend money to one who is of my people among you who is needy, do not be like a money lender. Charge him no interest. So for the Jews, in their way of seeing things, it's like, okay, fine, you can charge interest to somebody else, but not to a brother Israelite, right? So then when you put all these things together, what do you get? You get the Jews being the bankers of the Western world. And that is what inadvertently got them to be the bankers, not some sinister plot like the naive anti-Semites end up doing. So this is a great quote. So Paul Johnson writes in this great book, he says, the Jews reacted by engaging in the one business where Christian laws actually discriminated in their favor. So they became identified with the hated trade of money lending. Rabbi Joseph Carlin, who knew both France and Italy in the second half of the 15th century, wrote that the Jews of both countries hardly engaged in any other profession. So the Jews were just moneylenders and bankers and financiers and all that.
Hardly ever engaged in any other profession.
Right.
Interesting. So that makes sense where the concentration comes from.
Exactly. And again, it's very important for people to understand the benefits of finance and banking. Like finance and banking is what allows, how could you possibly do like a big project, like a skyscraper or a factory, if you can't quickly go to a banker and quickly get all the savings you need?
Interesting.
Right?
So Jorge Besada, I assume, not a fan of centralized banking.
Of course, centralized banking is bad. We want private banking and competition between banking, of course.
Interest rates should not be set by a centralized institution, but through the private market, but that banking and lending is necessary to a thriving economy.
Right. It's very good. It's what allows entrepreneurs. Imagine if you were limited to the savings of friends and family. Who could possibly ever build a skyscraper or a big factory, or something like that? And I mean, I'll try to say it quickly, but the interest rate, for example, assume that interest rates are at 10%. If interest rates are at 10% and you have a really good idea, let's just say you can borrow $1 million and you can create a business that in 1 year brings you sales revenue of 2 million. So you had a return on investment of 100%, right? So if you have an idea that has a return on investment of 100%, you can easily pay 10% interest, right? You borrow, you do your super duper idea that grows the economic pie by 100%. You pay back the loan and you made a profit. Now, if you have a business idea that is not very good, that can only grow the economic pie by 5 or 6%, or you have no interest in going into business, then you're motivated to save. You're motivated to work and produce, but you don't consume, you save, right? Whenever you save, you produced, you increase the economic pie, but you don't consume, right? You save. So you take your money, you give it to the bank, so that the wealth that you would have consumed is now consumed by the borrower who has the better idea. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So a 10% interest rate means that everyone who has an inferior idea, that the knowledge is poor, is crappy, he will just save and he will give the money to the bank so that the people that have the better ideas can now access the wealth and grow the economic pie by more than the interest rate. So it helps turn society, it gives society a computational boost, right? So we got economic competition spreading superior knowledge to society through competition. And we have the interest rate and finance and banking pairing savings with the best brains. So you see how society is like a supercomputer?
Sure.
Exactly. And who designed this computer?
No one in particular.
Exactly. That's Carl Menger.
Okay.
Key insight. All right. So, we're talking about the overrepresentation in finance and banking. So now, we talked about the benefits, but if you're economically ignorant, you're not going to understand this. And here we have Hitler showing his economic ignorance.
I went
So,
to the restroom and I came back and Hitler's on the screen.
exactly. He's
This
becoming
took an
quite popular.
interesting direction.
Yeah. So I can't read the first two sentences. So
I can.
Can you?
Yes. The directors of these institutions were
Good.
and
Without
are
exception, I'll
and
continue.
are yes.
Without exception, Jews. He's talking about banks and stock markets in particular. He says, I say without exception, for the few non-Jews who had a share in them are in the last resort nothing but screens, shop window Christians, whom one needs in order for the sake of the masses to keep up the appearance that these institutions were after all founded as a natural outcome of the needs and the economic life of all peoples alike, and were not, as was the fact, institutions which correspond only with the essential characteristics of the Jewish people and are the outcome of those characteristics.
So he's saying the Christians that were involved, they were just kind of token Christians to give off the impression, kind of someone might argue that the current chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, they just put him in there just to show that it's not all Jews.
Exactly. Hitler was clueless. He had no understanding that stock markets allow you to raise money, to have companies, to do all kinds of things, and then you can spread the ownership. There's all kinds of wonderful benefits, to stock markets. But
he called himself a socialist.
Exactly, he was a socialist. Clueless guy. Exactly. So again, we want to understand, the fallacies.
Was he a clueless guy entirely? Is there anything positive you can say about Hitler?
I mean, he was bad on the economy. He was bad on blaming everything on the Jews. He was bad on the racial stuff. He also thought that Europe was prosperous because of the race, and we got to keep the race clean and all that. So Hitler was pretty bad on everything. but I think even some of the economics, the thing is, like, in comparison to what? Stalin was way worse, right? And his economic policies, and what Hitler was doing was actually a little better than FDR. FDR was disastrous. Hitler managed to get Germany, the German economy probably ran a little better than what FDR was doing in the U.S.
Interesting.
Yeah,
we have some democratic socialists tuning in, and they will not agree with that.
Yeah. Actually, you know what? I could be very wrong, actually. Because in reality, the thing is, like, okay, so I'll jump a little bit here. The thing is, like, Germany was socialist as well. But Mises talks about two types of socialism. There was the Bolshevik, the Soviet Union style socialism, where the government just owns everything. Okay. There's no private sector in the means of production. There's no private businesses. But the German style socialism, you still have private companies. You still have owners of the private businesses, but they're hyper regulated. They have to do what the government wants.
Okay.
So in reality, it wasn't nowhere near as bad as the Bolshevik type socialism, but it was still, very bad. And, I said that maybe things worked a little better than the US. It's hard to tell. Maybe it's still.
Hitler adopted a difficult economy, I think, when he came into power.
Oh, true. Yeah. A lot of people say that, well, he nationalized the banks from the Rothschilds and all kinds of things or whatever. But it was just a basket case before that anyway, And actually, things were so bad at the end of the 1920s in Germany. They were printing so much money during the Weimar, Republic. But that is very complicated because they were forced to pay a lot of reparations payments at the end of the First World War.
Treaty
so they
of
ran
Versailles,
the printing.
kinda.
Huh?
The Treaty of Versailles, they would say, kind of screwed them over.
Exactly. Yeah, they had to pay huge reparations to everyone else. So in order to pay for their wounded, for their welfare state, all the bullshit everyone fell for, they just ran the printing press. And they had such rates of inflation that sometimes people would get paid twice a day. They get paid in the afternoon, so you can buy things quickly and then get paid again, because by the time you You waste money later, prices have already gone up 40%. Sometimes prices would double in a day.
Oh my gosh.
So no,
That
no.
sounds crazy.
I mean, Hitler. I mean, this gets so complicated. The First World War, the Treaty of Versailles. I mean, we're getting in another tangent, but I mean, Hitler was pretty bad, on most things, but he was nowhere near as bad, as they make him out, to be. And we'll get into that, a little bit in some things. So we were talking about the banking, right? So that was one fallacy. Now let's quickly go over the other major fallacy. Everybody loves to say that the Jews, invented the Bolshevik Revolution, right? That they're responsible for the communism and all this nonsense, right? So that is a massive error, right? People are inadvertently confusing Jewish overrepresentation with some kind of plot, and that is a major mistake, right? So I mean, but it's an understandable mistake. We have to understand the fallacies, right? So when we look at communism, it's an understandable fallacy. I mean, we got Karl Marx, the biggest name in communism, right? We got Lev Davidovich Bronstein, that's Trotsky. Trotsky was like the number 2 man. He was like one of Lenin's best friends. And actually, when the Bolshevik Revolution was going on, Lenin actually told Trotsky, look, you be the first leader of our new country. So Lenin told him, because Trotsky was really well read. He was the one that gave better speeches, that kind of stuff. And so Lenin offered him to be like the leader. But Trotsky told him, no. There's no way we can have a Jew be the leader of this new country, because Russia, had strong policies against the Jews. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in Russia, at the time. So Trotsky almost became the top guy. So you got Trotsky.
Is that why he changed his name to Trotsky?
I don't know. I think that nickname might have been just earlier. I don't think he changed it just for the Jewishness, but maybe he did. I forgot.
Was Lenin partially Jewish?
Yes. This was known a little later.
Okay.
Stalin's daughter, I think, was the one that found out that Lenin was 1/4 Jewish.
Okay.
And when Stalin's daughter told Stalin's like, okay, look, just keep your mouth shut about this. So now why would the Jews be overly represented in communism? Why would that happen? Right? So now let's try to make sense out of that. So number one, communism and socialism as an ideology requires the better educated to tell everybody else what to do. And statistically, the Jews were a little better educated than the Russian masses. And that's because a lot of people say, well, the Jews have a strong emphasis on reading the Torah, on reading the Old Testament, and so on. So they were maybe in Russia, about 1/3 of Jews could read and write, while only 10% of Russians could.
Okay.
So if you're better educated, naturally, without a conspiracy, you're going to rise to the top of a bureaucracy that requires the better educated to tell everybody else, what to do. And also, I'll read you this quote in a second. Also, if you have an ideology that gets rid of religion, if you have been a religiously persecuted minority, you're more likely to fall for this ideology that says, oh, we're no longer going to oppress people, minorities based on religion. We're all just going to be atheists, right? So that is another factor that inadvertently, makes sense that it would attract.
Contributed to them adopting that.
Exactly. So those are just a couple of the somewhat obvious factors, But this is a great quote from Lenin to show. So Lenin says, the fact that there were many Jewish intelligentsia members in the Russian cities was of great importance to the revolution. They put an end to the general sabotage that we were confronted with after the October Revolution. The Jewish elements were mobilized and thus saved the revolution at a difficult time. It was only thanks to this pool of a rational and literate labor force that we succeeded in taking over the state apparatus. So Lenin right there is telling you that it was thanks to the Jews that they had a success, and all that.
When that feeds into the...
Of course. It
Yes.
feeds into the, it's all their fault.
In Candace Owens, we haven't gotten into specifics of right now, but Candace Owens is a good example of, she will say some sharp things about the Bolshevik
Blaming the
revolution.
whole thing on them.
And
blah, blah,
it
blah.
being a Jewish revolution, and it's I mean,
Right.
that gets pretty carried away. We
Yeah.
haven't even begun to touch on some of the fallacies that modern personalities have been making. But continue.
Yeah. So here's a great example. So since there was such an overrepresentation of Jews in Bolshevism, in the revolution, it makes, and I told you earlier that there were 3 communist revolutions inside Germany at the end of the First World War, all led by communist Jews. So it makes perfect sense that Hitler would see the Russian Revolution as something
Mm,
that the Jews invented to take over the world. So here we
mm.
have a quote from Hitler in Mein Kampf, where he says, "In Russian Bolshevism, we ought to recognize the kind of attempt which is being made by the Jew in the 20th century to the secure dominion over the world."
Wow.
Big mistake, right?
Obviously, to blame
Yeah,
any entire group.
exactly. Just because you're confusing Jewish overrepresentation in a movement, you can make the same thing about capitalism. We got Milton Friedman, Ludwig von Mises, Murray Rothbard. There's a lot of Ayn Rand. There's a huge overrepresentation of Jewish capitalists, right? It's not a plot by the Jews, but people make fallacies, right? And the fallacies spread through the uneducated much faster than those.
Mises, you didn't mention Mises.
Oh yeah, Mises is Jewish, right? Mises,
Yes.
of course. Yeah, you're right. Big capitalist, the best. Oh, this is a quote. This is a very famous Jewish Zionist. We'll get to that in a second. Chaim Weizmann was one of the leading Zionists, and he said the non-Jewish population had not the same overwhelming thirst for knowledge as the Jews, who were
Hmm.
always knocking at the doors of the schools. So again, you have more educated people falling for socialism, giving the impression that it was a plot when it never was.
Interesting. Okay.
Right. So this is Mises. Mises says the Nazis have an ally in every town or village where there is a man eager to get rid of a Jewish competitor. The secret weapon of Hitler is the anti-Jewish inclinations of many millions of shopkeepers and grocers, of doctors and lawyers, professors and writers. Right? A lot of Germans, they wanted to get rid of Jewish competitors, so they went along with some of Hitler's anti-Semitism.
Sure.
Right?
Wow. That reminds me. I think it was in Uganda. Was it Idi Amin? Was Uganda? But when
I've heard of that name.
he took control of Uganda, Indians, the Asian Indians they owned the businesses in the area. And so then he kind of started to demonize them, and he announced, kick them all out. I shouldn't laugh. But
Yeah,
because
we
they
see
owned
the
the
same.
businesses, and there was such a popular sentiment that these people are exploiting us because they own the businesses. And you can see where the general population gets behind something like that, which is
Right.
obviously
Yeah,
disastrous.
yeah, and also I think a friend of mine told me it's the same thing happens in China. A lot of Chinese businessmen go to other countries and then they're mistreated because they're better competitors. So there's
Mm.
racism towards the Chinese and that kind of stuff. So again, it makes sense that we see this repeating everywhere. You know. So this is a great quote from Theodor Herzl. Okay, so this is now the first time I bring up Theodor Herzl. So Theodor Herzl is the founder of political Zionism. Okay, and gosh, because am I done with the Hitler thing? Okay, so we already talked. So we already talked about 2 major fallacies: the Jewish overrepresentation in banking and the Jewish overrepresentation in communism. Right. So this is a great quote from Theodor Herzl that shows us how wise this man was, but very profound. So he wrote a book called the Jewish State in 1886, which is kind of like the Bible of Zionism, right? The Jewish State. And we already talked about overrepresentation in finance and in socialism. And look what he writes. He says, because he identifies anti-Semitism, he says, we are what the ghetto made us. We have attained preeminence in finance because medieval conditions drove us to it. The same process is now being repeated. We are again being forced into finance. Now it is the stock exchange, by being kept out of other branches of economic activity. Being on the stock exchange, we are consequently exposed afresh to contempt. Remember Hitler bitching about the Jews in the stock markets? He
Mhm.
nailed this long before Hitler said that. So he says, at the same time, we continue to produce an abundance of mediocre intellects who find no outlet. And this endangers our social position as much as those are increasing wealth. He says, Educated Jews without means are now rapidly becoming socialists. Hence, we are certain to suffer very severely in the struggle between the classes because we stand in the most exposed position in the camps of both the socialists and the capitalists. He's realizing that the Jews are overrepresented in the socialist calamity and in the finance and banking and the capitalist stuff. So he knows that they're being disliked for both. That's a profound quote. I thought it was like badass. So this
Was
is the
he
guy.
socialist leaning? I know many of the early Zionists were.
I don't know that much about his economics. I'm pretty sure. No. He was definitely socialist leaning.
Okay.
Socialist, yeah. Anyway, I'll skip this one here because the Bolshevik Revolution, it was horrible for the Jews. The Jews got slaughtered because the Bolsheviks, since everybody thought that the Bolsheviks were Jewish, the existing bureaucracy in Russia, the White Army, because when the Bolsheviks took over, they created the Red Army, the communists, to take over the whole country, and the White Army were the ones that were defending what remained of the monarchy, of Christianity, the older traditions. And the White Army, seeing so many Jews, and Trotsky was the leader of the Red Army. So you had a Jew leading the Bolshevik Revolution, killing Christians, destroying the churches, destroying the mosques, destroying the synagogues, right? So the White Army saw communism as led by Jews, and the White Army started slaughtering Jews left and right. Yeah. So there's a quote from that book I showed earlier. He says, the consequences for the Jews, both immediate and long-term, both locally and worldwide, were appalling. The White Russian army seeking to destroy the Soviet regime treated all Jews as enemies. In the Ukraine, the civil war developed into the most extensive program in Jewish history. There were more than 1,000 separate incidents involving the killing of Jews. Over 700 communities in the Ukraine were involved and several hundred more in Russia. Between 60,000 and 70,000 Jews were murdered. In other parts of Eastern Europe, a similar identification of Jews with Bolshevism led directly to murderous attacks on harmless Jewish communities. They were particularly bloody in Poland after the failure of the Bolshevik invasion, and in Hungary after the fall of the Bela Kun regime, a Jewish guy who tried to push communism there. They occurred intermittently in Romania throughout the 1920s. This is very important. This is very important. In all three countries, the local communist parties had been largely created and run by non-Jewish Jews. And in each case, it was the unpolitical, traditional, observant Jews of the ghettos and villages who paid the penalty. Right?
So non-Jewish, so atheistic Jews.
Right. The atheistic Jews were launching all of these communist revolutions. And then the observant Jews, who wanted nothing to do with the Bolshevik Revolution and all this chaos, they paid the price. Right? It's like our favorite rabbi, Jacob Shapiro, getting slaughtered because a bunch of Jewish commies are coming up with their stuff.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was that's a great quote. Okay, so now let's jump finally to Zionism, right? So what happened, right? In the late 1800s, right? Theodor Herzl, and they want to overcome anti-Semitism, right? They want to overcome anti-Semitism. And Theodor Herzl's like, well, how can we overcome anti-Semitism? So Theodor Herzl comes up with an idea. He wants to convert the Jews to Christianity. That was one of his ideas. So, this man, he was a secular guy. He detested, you know all about this, and he detested Judaism. He just wanted to, help overcome anti-Semitism. So he wanted to convert the Jews to Christianity. And then he said, wait a minute, why don't we create our own country? And he started, going down that path. But again, here's the key thing. Anti-Semitism, right, is just a set of intellectual errors, right? Confusing Jewish overrepresentation in communism, confusing Jewish overrepresentation in finance and banking, blaming them for pornography, it's a set of fallacies, right? But you can only overcome fallacies by understanding them and overcoming them intellectually. But Zionism didn't do that, right? Zionism essentially asked the Jews to abandon where they were really from, right? The real traditions, the real property that they own, the real languages, the real culture. Because the Jews in England spoke English. The Jews of Germany spoke German. The Jews of Spain spoke Spanish. They were getting increasing freedom. The Jews got equal freedoms in the United States and France from the moment our country got together, right? 1776. They had equal rights in the Austro-Hungarian Empire from like 1850. And that is one of the reasons why Ludwig von Mises, the von is a title given by the nobility, right? So Mises' grandfather was I believe he was one of the first Jews. He was one of the Jews that got the von because the Austro-Hungarian Empire now treated Jews equally, right? So the Jews got equal rights in Germany in 1860, in the Ottoman Empire, 1870, or something like that. So the Jews were getting equal rights everywhere in the world, and they were integrating, right? They were having, as a matter of fact, from the year 1800 to 1900, right, in the entire 19th century, right? According to Grog, some estimates, from maybe in the low dozens, Jews got actually killed due to anti-Semitic violence.
Interesting.
In 100 years, including the Middle East, right? You would think that, oh my God, in 100 years, Jews are getting pogroms everywhere and they're dying all over the place. No, right? Everybody, the idea that we're all going to have equal rights was spreading. We overcame slavery. Women got equal rights, right? Everybody was getting equal rights, Now, unfortunately, in Russia, since Russia was the more draconian, they were more backward, the Jews still had a lot of restrictions. They still did not have equal rights compared to
And that's where a lot of the pogroms were.
Yes, exactly. Right. The major pogroms where the most Jews got killed over the last couple hundred years happened in the Russian Empire. Right? And that's another reason why Jews would be more likely to fall for the Bolshevik Revolution, because they were still being mistreated by the existing bureaucracy.
Let's do away with this entire religious identity thing.
Yeah,
right?
or this oppressive Christian church that has been bothering us. Yeah,
fair,
we'll join the Bolsheviks.
Yeah, fair.
Right. So very important.
So even if there was some anti-Christian sentiment from them at the time, it is to be understood.
Exactly. Yeah. So you have all these guys coming up with this idea, we're going to create our own country. But remember, again, by asking the Jews to abandon where they're really from, to then coerce hundreds of thousands of Christians, Muslims, and anti-Zionist Jews in the holiest place in the Western world, to coerce them to live under a made-up, atheist made-up, because Theodore Herzl, he's the first designer of the Israeli flag. I mean, what person who really believes in the God of Abraham can put up with living in a country where the new rulers are a bunch of secular atheist Jews that detest religion, that just, it's just their pet project. As our Rabbi Shapiro says, it was a social engineering project.
Much like the quote we have in front of us from Jabotinsky.
Exactly, right. So this brings us to Jabotinsky. So Jabotinsky, he was one of these people who he wanted to modernize Jews. This is very important, right? The Soviets, the socialists, right? The socialists wanted to get rid of, they wanted to, in their own eyes, they wanted to modernize civilization. They wanted to create a new socialist man who would share the wealth, who would work on the science, who would be good in mathematics, who would not be religious, So the same thing happened with the Zionists. The Zionists were unhappy with the Jews of the past, who were doing other things, who cared about God, who wanted to be pious and so on. So Jabotinsky is a perfect example. This quote. So again, he says, take the Yid, the Jew of today, and try to imagine in our minds his exact opposite. The Yid is ugly, sickly, and lacks handsomeness. We shall endow the ideal image of the Hebrew, the new Zionist, with masculine beauty. The Yid is disgusting to all. And I'm reminded, the recent talk you had with Shapiro. Shapiro says, well, he wanted to make the Jews so that now they would win the Eurovision contest. Right. So again, this guy...
He did. He wanted a strong voice. He wanted to look masculine. Benjamin Netanyahu, in a way, kind of embodies what they're kind of going for. He looks kind of... He acts strong. He's a very fierce leader. Yeah. Physically looks masculine.
Yeah. But the thing is, the Jews could have achieved that by just, they could have become more masculine in Germany, in France, in all these places. They didn't need their own state, to even to do that if they wanted to do that, right?
That's crazy that Jabotinsky, this quote, I know I read it during the Shapiro interview, and we've seen it so much, But looking back at those words, this is one of the creators of Zionism. Is just wild.
Yeah. And I stumbled upon this quote thanks to Shapiro.
Me too. Yeah.
Yeah.
I had heard him. He's mentioned it in his podcast. Very very often.
And then this was another incredible quote. So just like the socialists created a new morality, right, where everybody had to go along with the plans of the experts. Everybody, you had to shun religion. You had to do. They created a new socialist man. So Jabotinsky is creating a new religion, a new, not a new religion, a new moral code, right? Which has become, sadly, the religion of the West. So Jabotinsky said, we hold that Zionism is moral and just. And since it is moral and just, justice must be done. No matter whether Joseph or Simon or Ivan or Ahmed agree with it or not, there is no other morality. So now it became moral for the Jews to make criminals out of Christians and Muslims and anti-Zionist Jews who did not want to live under some made-up Jabotinsky, or Theodor Herzl flag. Very important too, like David Ben Gurion, who is really like the first prime minister of Israel. He's really known as the architect of Israel because he was like the guy in there for many years, the first prime minister. He led all these things. He was another clueless socialist. He was such a socialist that he went to Moscow in 1923 to celebrate the 7th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. Wow. And to get a glimpse of his hero, Lev Davidovich Bronstein Trotsky, right? So how could it possibly be moral for these communist, atheist, totally clueless bureaucrats to coerce millions of people under their own little kumbaya flag, to coerce an identity made up by a bunch of people that have no connection whatsoever to the God of Abraham, right? That the Jews, that the Muslims and the Christians, we all share that tradition. How can anyone put up with that? It was going to lead to chaos from day one. It was a mistake.
To be based on calling it the Jewish state, which, regardless of what anyone says, Judaism is a religion.
Exactly.
But to have it founded by a bunch of atheists is wild in hindsight, who are clearly ashamed of being Jews also. Very bizarre.
Yeah, very bizarre. But as I was telling you earlier, like when you have so many people that want to push their favorite ideology, you have a distributed network of bright people that are always looking for good excuses. So they said, oh, maybe we can pitch it to the Christians. Let's find the little Bible verses, that may justify Zionism. So little by little, they evolved their Zionism to spread and create what it is today. This massive complex of all these things that are just, doing a lot of harm. So just, to summarize, so the Zionists did not overcome anti-Semitism via reason, sympathy for the misguided, and education, which are the only things that overcome fallacies, and attempted to overcome anti-Semitism via moral pontification, condemnations, vilification, violence, separation, which could only intensify anti-Semitism. That's all there's to it. And like the socialists, right, they compounded the problem by tying their identity and morality to errors requiring the coercion of thousands in Palestine via their Jewish state, the entire West and the US via the necessary taxation to fund Americans' now yearly 1.5 trillion military spending to destroy Israel enemies, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Iran, and hate speech laws that criminalize ideological opposition.
Turkey, you need to mention Turkey.
Oh, sorry. Turkey's coming up, of course.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, you got me there.
Okay.
CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, Jonathan Greenblatt, has mentioned that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And it gets even worse, and this will relate to something else in the future. He also said that anti-Zionism is genocide. Okay? So this man is brainwashing Jews into thinking that people who are critical of Zionism want to genocide them.
Which is a secular Zionism, which at its core is a secular project. But to be critical of that is genocide.
Exactly. To be critical of this error means that we want to genocide the Jews. What does that do to a bunch of Jews? It radicalizes some of them, right? If you think that an anti-Zionist is like a Hamas terrorist or somebody that wants to kill you, that's dangerous. It's dangerous. Like, I am an anti-Zionist. I believe that Zionism, just like communism, was an intellectual error. That doesn't mean I want to harm the Jews, right?
Have you ever advocated for harming Jews, Jorge?
Of course not. Thanks for asking me. We can make a good clip of this. Of course not, right? I am a Misesian.
Are
right?
you sure? Are you
I am so.
sure?
Okay, be careful.
You don't secretly advocate for harming
Oh,
people?
so let me continue. So I'll continue here. So, Israeli author of the great books, The Invention of the Jewish People and The Invention of the Land of Israel, Shlomo Sand, astutely mentioned that, quote, Zionism has become a sort of Stalinism. Because ultimately, that is what it has become, right? In reality, most Americans have no clue that, like communism, which must kill anyone who disagrees, right? Communism requires killing people who don't go along. You either pay the money, you either do what the government says, because the government plans can't work if people are free, right? If you're a communist dictator and the people are free not to go along with the master plan can't possibly work, right? It can't work. If the people, oh no, I'm going to start my own business, I don't want to do this. It can't. Communism requires killing everyone who disagrees. And it's the same thing with Zionism, right? You either have to be coerced via hate speech laws, or you are coerced into paying the taxes that are needed for the continuous destruction of all the critics of Zionism. It has to be carried out by force. Most people don't realize it, but they need to wake up quickly. And
It's an aggressive form of nationalism.
Aggressive national, inadvertently. Remember, the Zionists don't feel like they're oppressing Americans. They feel like, oh, we're brothers in arms. We got to kill the evil, crazy religious Muslims, the Islamists. We're brothers in arms, because we are the only democracy in the Middle East. We're fellow white people. We speak English. We're for the science. We have a democracy. We treat women with equal rights. We have so many things in common. We're a beacon of Western civilization. So they definitely, the Zionists do not see themselves as having to kill every American who ultimately doesn't want to go along with their ideology. They don't see it that way. Just like the communists. You think the average socialist in New York realizes that the only way his socialist dream could be carried out is by killing everyone who doesn't want to go along with it?
No,
they have no idea. And neither do the Zionists. The Zionists live in their kumbaya world, and so on, without realizing this.
They may be open to a little incremental step towards censorship.
Oh, sure, but that's needed to keep the the kulaks. Remember those profiteers? We gotta get rid of the kulaks, and we gotta get rid of the anti-Semites. We can't tolerate.
We don't want to hurt anyone, but
but they bring it up on themselves. I mean, obviously, yeah.
It's wild.
Yeah. So here it is, right? CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, Jonathan Greenblatt. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism is genocide. That's awful. And great author, Zionism has become a sort of Stalinism. Yeah. Also very important, when Zionism first got started, right? Remember, just like communism destroyed just like communism destroyed the identities that were there before, it destroyed Christianity, right? In China, it destroyed, right? Communism is a new identity, right? That's what socialism is a new identity, right? In Russia, prior to communism, you had Christianity, some form of Orthodox Christianity. Then communism came, and that got destroyed, right? So Zionism did the same. The first victims of Zionism were the Jews themselves, who abandoned who they really were in Europe, in the Islamic world. They abandoned their languages, their synagogues, everything. So at the very beginning, Zionism was very unpopular. Few people know this. I mean, a lot of Jews who study the history of Zionism, everybody who studies the history of Zionism knows this. So when Herzl wanted to have the first Zionist Congress, he wanted to have it in Munich, Germany, right? But the local rabbis hated the idea, and they told him, oh, no, I'm sorry. I got a different quote. Sorry. No, let me fast forward here. Yeah. So the local rabbis told him, we comprise a separate community solely with respect to religion. Regarding nationality, we feel totally at one with our fellow Germans and therefore strive towards the realization of the spiritual and moral goals of our dear fatherland with an enthusiasm equaling theirs. Right? That's what the German Jews told Herzl. Right? We only differ with our Catholic Germans just on religion, or Protestant Germans, but we feel as Germans as they do because they spoke German. They were living in the same cities. They were doing business with each other. They were Germans. Their synagogues had been there for hundreds of years, right? The leading Zionist after Herzl's death, Chaim Weizmann, who I quoted earlier, he said, for assimilated Jews, the Jews that are just integrating into the cities and maybe they're not becoming religious anymore, he said, they looked upon it, at Zionism, as a primitive tribalism. He nailed it, because that's what Zionism is. He said, they looked upon it as a primitive tribalism. They felt themselves called upon to rescue Judaism from Zionism. These people are dead against Zionism, right? The Jews that were integrating into German society, into British society, in America, those Jews wanted nothing to do with suddenly saying, oh, no, we got to go to some other country and do something. They wanted nothing to do with it, right?
I think that the I watched a movie called The Chosen from 1981, and it outlines two Jewish friends in New York City, and it was like 1945-ish, something like that. And one came from a family that was more pro Zionism, and the other was more anti-Zionism, and it really embodies and paints the picture of what was viewed as a much more polarizing topic among the Jewish community back then, that it was very common that people would be, and I'm not saying that it is not today, actually, I think it is. I mean, Jews in New York voted overwhelmingly for Mondami, and that's in 2025, so I think it's still this way. But I thought it was very fascinating to see that movie where they dove into the real religious Jews prior to the creation of the state of Israel. It was very controversial, and many of the most religious Jews, as still is the case today, but were very opposed to the creation of the state of Israel.
Yeah, and I mean today, books, like Jews in Israel, Zionism, very different than the Jews in New York. Right? I remember Daniel Gordis is a Jewish guy in Israel who wrote a book kind of about that. I forgot his points, but he felt like the New York Jews don't understand as well, and he's pushing more of the Israeli view. But now this quote here is very important from Herzl. Again, remember, you can only overcome anti-Semitism through reason and logic and education. And Zionism made no effort whatsoever to do that. And not only that, it benefits from anti-Semitism. So if anything, it grows anti-Semitism. So this is what Theodor Herzl said. He said, the anti-Semites will become our most dependable friends. The anti-Semitic countries are allies. Great exertions will hardly be necessary to spur on the movement. Anti-Semites provide the requisite impetus. They need only do what they did before, and then they will create a desire to emigrate where it did not previously exist and strengthen it where it existed before. So he's saying that, again, if you're a Zionist, anti-Semitism is good. It justifies your ideology. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
And we see it everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, again, it's like, like a rocket that is about to reach orbit. Once you reach orbit, you can just keep going around the Earth without anything. But it's about to reach orbit, but it runs out of fuel and it comes crashing down. That's what Zionism did. It brought the whole world back down to pure tribalism, us versus them. And so now, once you get Zionism, instead of getting the Jews to have less anti-Semitism and more integration, now you started having an ideology that did the opposite. Whenever there's a little bit of anti-Semitism somewhere, oh, look, we need our own Jewish state. Look how bad they're treating us. They blow it out of proportion, right? Now you started getting money sent to the Zionist causes, to propaganda, to say, oh, look how evil everyone is. And we had the reverse. Things were getting better, and now things started to get really bad.
And as Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro points out so often, they end up saying we need Jews need to go to Israel. We need to get them to this safe haven, when in reality, it's the most dangerous place on the planet for
Exactly.
Jews. I mean, look over the past few weeks, how many Jews have been killed by rockets in Israel. It's insane.
And they're becoming increasingly hated outside of Israel. We see
Oh,
videos
my
of businesses.
goodness. We haven't even begun to jump into that. Legitimate anti-Semitism is on a big time uptick right now.
Yeah, yeah. So now I got a couple of quotes here that show. So again, so Zionism began to polarize the planet and make things worse. So now let's look at the mindset that led to the Second World War. Just a couple of good quotes here. So just like communism was an ideology that actually made everything it tried to improve worse, right? It destroyed the economy. It created more social injustice. It did the opposite of what it tried to do. Same shit with Zionism, right? And we can see that. So the patterns are just repeating, right? So let's learn from World War II. Let's learn a little bit of history. So now, very important, sadly, we got to get this right? As an understandable reaction to Nazi anti-Semitism, right? The simplistic, tribalistic, good versus evil mindset that the increasingly Zionized Jews were creating in the US in the lead up to World War II was no match for the reason of more nuanced thinkers like the great American hero and the first man to fly non-stop across the Atlantic Ocean, Charles Lindbergh, right? And you and I, remember, we got our rabbi friend. You remember our rabbi friend one point told us some letters in the 1930s where the Jews were trying to reason and not escalate with the Germans. You remember that?
Yes.
He gave us some letters.
Not Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro. We have another mysterious, unnamed rabbi friend who's very a wealth of knowledge. But yes, I do remember he referenced those letters.
So we have, the problem is that we're outnumbered. The people that want to understand, have sympathy, and overcome the intellectual fallacies, we're outnumbered by the tribalism. The tribalism is like, oh no, you're good, you're evil, and we're the good guys, and they're evil, and look what they're saying about us, and if you don't support us, you're a traitor. Sadly, we're outnumbered. So we can see
on both sides.
On both sides, yeah. Yeah, we're outnumbered by the anti-Semites.
An acknowledgement of the true rise of anti-Semitism is very real right now. I think it's important.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
important to acknowledge it, I should say.
Yeah, to
acknowledge the actual rise of what was the, sorry to hijack your point, what was the poll that we talked before we went on the air that you saw on Twitter?
Oh, yeah. And we'll revisit this. Kim.com, he's a very famous computer guy, Kim.com. He has a Twitter following of like 1.7 million people. And he's very critical of Zionism, which can be good. But when you marry it with some bad anti-Jewish stuff, it's very bad. So he created a poll saying, I would like to remove the Jews from my country or something like that. And like 85% of the people voted yes.
Is he an American?
No, I think he's an Australian.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I had some friends who I consider to be friends sending me this and like laughing and saying, haha, and kind of agreeing with it. Like, I'm sure they voted yes, that they thought that the Jews should be
deported. Yeah. Or they're malicious or
removed from the United States.
Yeah.
So I do think the prevalence of the uptick of legitimate, I mean, that is legitimate anti-Semitism.
Oh, no, it's totally, it's real anti-Semitism.
I
totally agree. We agree that anti-Semitism is definitely rising.
Big time. And I don't, I don't want to sound like a, social justice warrior who's calling everyone racist or anything like that. But when you see results of something like that, where people are saying they're connecting these conspiratorial dots that you referenced, and they're saying, what is the other solution? Look at all the problems they are causing. When in reality, I think Zionism is driven in large part by Christians.
I mean,
I don't think
that is a factor. Right.
I don't think it's all Jews, I guess is my point. I think that it's important. And also some of the best critics of Zionism are Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro, Dave Smith, Jeffrey Sachs, Norman Finkelstein. I mean, I'm probably leaving however many out.
Yeah, but it's important to do the best that we can and overcome all the fallacies, right? We really have to, like, it's a big mistake to only focus on the Zionist fallacies if you're not also criticizing the anti-Semitic fallacies
Sure.
that then lead to
Yes.
the Zionist ones.
Yeah. Yes.
We have to, because then we're not looking deep enough and we're coming off as one-sided. We need to have enough people that understand both fallacies and courageously deal with both. Because if it's very easy to be in the anti-Semite camp, those people. But when you criticize both sides, it's a lot more, you're a lot lonelier.
It's not as popular.
It's not as popular.
It's not as popular. I have so many friends. I come from the right. I'm a white Republican guy. Let's be honest. I was born in Ohio. I'm a white Republican guy. That's who I am. And I started to stumble upon these types of ideas through the libertarian world many years ago. But over these past few years, since October 7th, I've seen many of my kind, right, Republican-leaning guys who they start to open their eyes to, oh my God, what are they doing over in Israel? This is horrible. And the natural instinct is to just take it in the wrong direction. Just the absolute wrong direction.
Yeah.
It's blaming the Jews. Did you know that so-and-so Jew back 100 years ago did this? Did you hear this story? That type of thing. And it's very sad to see. And I try to address it when I see it. And I'm sure some of the people I consider to be friends are annoyed by my points of me continually pointing out how I think they're, falling into certain fallacies. But it just makes the whole thing so much worse.
Yeah, and then we get criticized by both sides. Obviously, the Zionists hate our guts.
Yes.
And the anti-Zionists, the anti-Semites, hate our guts too.
Yes.
Because we're sympathizing. With all the things so that's why we need, I'm glad to have you as a buddy. And we need to create our own little beacon so maybe we can lead others.
The Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro caucus.
Yeah. Okay, we got to get together and do that at the convention.
At the Libertarian Convention, right?
Yeah.
Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro, you have said on repeated, what verbiage, Jorge, have you used to describe Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro? You said he is the key. I forget exactly what you said, but you put it very well. You think he's the key to saving civilization? Or, something along those lines. You may have not said that, but something along those lines.
Similar, yeah.
That how important is it to have someone like Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro who articulates and embodies true Torah Judaism, which is basically being a pacifist type mentality.
Yeah.
It's not pro-war. It's not pro-nationalism.
Yeah.
It's none of those things. It is a religious religion. And I can see where he's very frustrated with the state of the conceptions. Let's say this. I set up Jake Shields. I'm in the jiu-jitsu and MMA world. I've interviewed Jake Shields in the past. Before October 7th, I did. And I knew he was a little wild back then, so I enjoyed the interviews. I interviewed him twice. I have his cell phone number. He responds when I text him. I got him to agree to do an episode. I think he was going to do the big production thing with Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro at Jake Shields' beautiful studio.
Mm.
But when we got Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro involved, we explained to him, look, we've got you, because he wants a big, he wants a big audience.
Yeah.
But he looked into some of the things Jake Shields has said, and he said, no, thanks. And I don't think that was necessarily a bad move on Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro's part. You and I would both like to have seen him go there and address some of the fallacies and those types of things. But he saw so many places where Jake Shields has just taken this in the wrong direction entirely.
Yeah. Too much of the Jews. Yeah. I mean, hopefully we can do some Jewish plotting and, get him to change his mind. That's really, that's one of our goals, right? If we can get Shapiro with Jake Shields, that would be spectacular.
We got him with Tom Woods, didn't we?
Yeah. Great job.
Well,
Yeah, we're doing some serious Jewish plotting, behind this.
This is true conspiratorial behind the scenes.
Yeah.
I'd love to see Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro with Candace Owens or Tucker Carlson.
Oh no, that seems like the inertia is gonna make it happen, because we already got Carrie, to mention him, the Catholic lady at the
Yes.
thing. She tweeted all the stuff. It seems like it's really the environment that causes the pressure for the right ideas to move. And sooner or later, it has to happen, because that's the only way we're gonna get out of this mess. We need the people to really understand things as well as we can. And Shapiro is what provides the best explanation from a Jewish, perspective of all this stuff. So we can say, look, it's the best Jews themselves, the real Jews, the real carriers of real Western civilization, of the tradition of the real God of Abraham. Those Jews are the ones that are against this nonsense. And again, from my perspective, the real Christians also know. I think, how can one really be a Christian when you really understand Ben Gurion, all of these atheist, idiots? I mean, again, now I'm breaking my own rules. What a nice guy I am, But I remember another quote, like Ben Zion Netanyahu, who was Bibi's dad. Okay, he wrote a wonderful biography of 5 main Zionists, because he's a big fan of the Zionist. And regarding Theodor Herzl, he said something along the lines. He said, quote, Theodor Herzl really understood the law of greatness. If you believe you're great, you're going to do great things. And that is the law of greatness.
Sounds like Donald Trump.
Exactly. I'm like, if a 4-year-old writes that in cursive, that's impressive. But for that to be the foundation of creating a state in the holiest of locations in the Western world, all of these early Zionists were total buffoons. That's just the reality. Anyway, we're almost done here.
And to associate them with the oldest religion known to man
It's
is
sacrilegious.
If there's such thing as blasphemy,
Yeah.
or those types of words that are, you would think people who study religion are very familiar with the concept of blasphemy or heresy or
Yeah,
right.
it would definitely apply. It would apply.
Yeah, I mean, what better example than a bunch of atheists claiming to fly the flag of Judaism? It's insane.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, let's read this. So this is the great Charles Lindbergh on September 11, 1941. So he says, it is not difficult to understand why Jewish people desire to overthrow of Nazi Germany. The persecution they suffered in Germany would be sufficient to make bitter enemies of any race. No person with a sense of dignity of mankind can condone the persecution of the Jewish race in Germany. But no person of honesty and vision can look in their pro-war policy here today without seeing the dangers involved in such a policy for both of us and them. Instead of agitating for war, the Jewish groups in this country should be opposing it in every possible way, for they will be among the first to feel its consequences. Tolerance is a virtue that depends upon peace and strength. History shows that it cannot survive war and devastations. A few far-sighted Jewish people recognize this and stand opposed to intervention, but the majority still do not. Very wise. Again, we want to understand and sympathy, but the mob is like,
He was, of course, labeled a horrible anti-Semite for that.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
He was.
He was a horrible anti-Semite?
He was labeled as a horrible anti-Semite. He was. In his time, I watched a documentary not long ago with my wife, and because of these many really pretty rational statements that he released, and they were not anti-Jewish. It's like someone would listen to today's episode and think, man, Jorge and Kelly sure hate the Jews.
Yeah, and the truth is that, I mean, we'll get to that in a second. I got a great quote from Murray Rothbard. I mean, the truth is, of course, Hitler was an anti-Semite. Very important. As soon as Hitler got into power, within a few months, he already passed some laws preventing Jews from getting all kinds of government jobs. It was awful. Then a couple of years later, in 1935, he passed the horrible Nuremberg laws. The Jews couldn't marry non-Jews. I mean, it's awful, right? Hitler was an anti-Semite. What he did was awful. And his anti-Semitism is what grew. Jewish support that helped spark the war, right? Hitler's anti-Semitism has to be seen as a major factor in sparking the war. It's the anti-Semites and the Zionist Jews who want to overcome anti-Semitism via violence, coercion, separation. Those two polarized the world, leading to the Second World War. If we had a bunch of Jacob Shapiros in 1933 when Hitler took over power, we would have dialogue and we would never have had all of these laws and all these polarizations. But we did not have enough Jacob Shapiros. We had, anti-Semitism, you're a criminal, and that only increases the polarizations, right? You see, the thing is, like, when people make mistakes, and I get it, anti-Semitism is a mistake. Making criminals out of them, vilifying them, does not overcome the fallacies. So you're destined to increase the polarizations and have world wars. So there's a great quote here, just to show, right? So the Second World War was really just the polarization of anti-Semitic Hitler, bothering the Jews, and the Zionist Jews in the United States vilifying Hitler until we got a world war. So in February 9th, 1938, 7 months before the outbreak of the war, and it's important to see it right now with what's happening with Iran, right? The Polish ambassador in Washington, Count Jerzy Potocki, he reported back home to the foreign minister of Warsaw on the Jewish role in, quote, in creating a war psychosis which would plunge the entire world into war. This is what he said. This is 7 months before the war broke out. He said, quote, the Jews are right now the leaders in creating a war psychosis which would plunge the entire world into war and bring about a general catastrophe. This mood is becoming more and more apparent. This hatred has become a frenzy. It is propagated everywhere and by every means, in theaters, in the cinema, in the press. The Germans are portrayed as a nation living under the arrogance of Hitler, which wants to conquer the whole world and drown all of humanity in an ocean of blood. In conversations with Jewish press representatives, I have repeatedly come upon the inexorable and convinced view that war is inevitable. This international Jewry exploits every means of propaganda to oppose any tendency towards any kind of consolidation and understanding between nations. So the Jews, I don't blame them. I don't blame them, right? If you don't know any better and you got Hitler blaming everything on the Jews, it makes sense that I want to destroy Germany. But you have to realize that to get rid of an anti-Semitic dictator that has killed 90 Jews in 6 years and have a world war that destroys 90 million lives is a mistake, right? You always want to avoid a massive, world war. So that was a great quote showing, and right now we see it. Who is clamoring for war? Mark Levin, Ben Shapiro, they're the leaders. We got to get rid of the anti-Semites. If we risk a world war, so be it. We got to get rid of the evildoers. And the same mentality is spreading.
Scary.
Scary, yeah, because we see it. Now, on September 10th, 1941, about 3 months before the U.S. entered the Second World War, right? So September 1941, we entered the war in November 1941, right? So about 3 months, Chaim Weizmann, okay, he sends a letter to Churchill mentioning how the Jews helped England defeat Germany in World War I. Okay? The Jews played a role, in World War by bringing the United States into the war, and how they will help England do the same thing again. So in this letter, Chaim Weizmann is telling Churchill that it was the Jews that helped persuade the Americans to get into World War I, right? And how they will help the Americans get into World War II again. This is what he tells them. Quote, 2 years have passed since, on the outbreak of the war, I offered to His Majesty's government on behalf of the Jewish people the fullest active support of Jews in Palestine and throughout the world. I have spent months in America, traveling up and down the country and clearly searching the American scene. Forces over there are finely balanced. The position is uncertain. There is only one big ethnic group which is willing to stand to a man for Great Britain and a policy of all-out aid for her, the 5 million American Jews. From Secretary Morgenthau, Governor Lehman, Justice Frankfurter, down to the simplest Jewish workman or trader, they are conscious of all of this struggle against Hitler implies. It has been repeatedly acknowledged by British statesmen that it was the Jews in the last war, World War I, effectively helped to tip the scales in America in favor of Great Britain. They are keen to do it and may do it again. Right? He's clearly letting Churchill know that it was thanks to the Jews, to the Zionists, Jews, that they persuaded the Americans to join England in World War I.
Jeez.
And he is convinced that they're going to help the British again. And it makes sense. I don't blame Weizmann. Remember, Hitler was an anti-Semite. Right? But again, right? Now, very important. After the US entered World War II, Weizmann mentioned the obvious in a speech on December 3rd, 1942. In New York, he said that this is our war. He says, "We are not denying and are not afraid to confess that this is our war and that it is waged for the liberation of Jewry. Stronger than all fronts is our front, that of Jewry. We are not only giving this war a financial support on which the entire war production is based. We are not only providing our full propaganda power, which is the moral energy that keeps this war going." So after the US got into the war, he's saying, this is our war. And it makes sense. I don't blame the guy. You know, he wants to get rid of Hitler. He's going to persuade the Americans to get into the war. Horrible. So the thing is that, so in both world wars, you had Zionists who understandably feel like their Zionism is moral, and they feel like it's totally justified to persuade people to go into a world war to destroy an anti-Semite. I totally get it. But so Americans think that, oh, they're fighting some great war against, some evil force. But in reality, to a significant degree, not all of it, right? There were many factors in the Second World War. It wasn't just, the Jews. But to a significant degree, you had all of these Jews persuading the masses into another calamity, right? So the increasingly Zion, so again, because Americans think, they're fighting the evil Hitler or whatever, but in reality, there's a lot of persuasion going behind the scenes to see, So the increasingly Zionized Jews and their supporters did the utmost to destroy Hitler, and they succeeded at the cost of World War II and all that emerged from it. Mises' pupil and fellow Jew Murray Rothbard wisely and courageous summarizes the truth. So there's a nice paragraph from Murray Rothbard. Rothbard, clearly, he says, Germany and Hitler were not uniquely guilty of launching World War II. Indeed, they were scarcely guilty at all. Hitler, in brief, in foreign affairs, was not uniquely evil monster or demon who would continue to gobble up countries diabolically until stopped by superior force. Hitler had no designs, no plan, not even vague intimations to expand westward against Britain and France, let alone the United States. Hitler admired the British people and wished to collaborate with it. Not only did Hitler do this with insight, he did it with patience, as Taylor excellently shows. It was a review of a famous book, by a gentleman named Taylor. Hitler, just a quick recap of, the First World War. The Germans, the United States entered the First World War, and what would have likely been a stalemate suddenly turned into a defeat for the Germans, right? And then you got the Vindictive Treaty of Versailles. In the Vindictive Treaty of Versailles, Germany, they sliced up Germany. 10% of the German population became minorities in new countries where they were hated. Czechoslovakia, this is like made up, many Germans, there was an entire city called Danzig, which used to be part of Germany, but now they gave a chunk of land to Poland. And now that city of Danzig was totally cut off from Germany. And that led to the beginning of the Second World War. So Hitler's Hitler's foreign policy was to unite all the Germans. Sometimes by force, he rolled his tank into Sudetenland, another German area that had been given to others. And then what led to the Second World War was Danzig. Hitler wanted to unite a city of 95% Germans. How the fuck can those people not be united with the Reich if they want to be united with the Reich? So Hitler wanted to just have some railroads so that the people could freely pass. He didn't even want all the land because the land, it was called the Polish Corridor. It was a chunk of land that was given to Poland, so Poland had access to the sea. And by giving them that chunk of land, it cut off Danzig. So Hitler was like, look, you still want access to the sea? That's fine. We'll let you keep that land so you have access to the sea. But at least let us have some railroads and unite these Germans that want to be a part of the Reich. But the Poles, with the encouragement of FDR and the Jews are saying, oh my God, how can you ever give in to Hitler? Because Hitler is just pure evil. You got to say no. And eventually Hitler threw in the towel and, the Second World War started. But again, Hitler, again, in today's mythology, Hitler is some non-Homo sapiens. It's just like Putin. We see it, right? We know that Putin is, right, pure evil.
Most evil man ever.
Exactly. And the Chinese are evil too. And of course, the Iranians, they're not even Homo sapiens, right? So where does this psychosis come from?
Iran might be the one that's been propagandized as being the most evil in our current climate over the past 20 years.
Oh, yeah. And for good reason, too. And I'll get to that in a second. The truth is, again, we know that we also have to look at anti-Semitism because it's real. There are a lot of people, I'm sure, within the Iranian bureaucracy that may say truly anti-Semitic things.
I'm sure. I see it here in Kentucky.
Exactly.
So I can't imagine the.
Exactly. So
those countries, all the countries that are neighboring there, I'm sure it's pretty heated. I can imagine.
Not only that, upwards of 85% of the entire Muslim population is totally anti-Zionist. So if 85% of Muslims totally hate
across the world?
Oh, yeah. 85%. If you do polls in any Muslim country, 85% or higher are totally against Zionism. Therefore, it's impossible to have a democracy in the Middle East. Because then you get a government that is going to be critical of Israel. It's going to give money to Palestinian armed resistance. That's why the entire Middle East is always overthrown via American wars, or they have some puppet guy that, kind of goes along, So anyway. All right,
I thought the Abraham Accords fixed everything.
Oh, of course. This is very complex because, Netanyahu and the Zionists, it's a big topic, but the Zionists, they love Milei. Actually, the Zionists, the current Israeli government, one of the things that happened in Israel, something that's also very important, the early Zionist governments were heavily socialist, right? But then in 1977, Menachem Begin was Begin was one of the early terrorists. A terrorist is a freedom fighter to the Jews and a terrorist to the others. So Begin was one of the leaders of the Irgun, right? And he was the guy that bombed the King David Hotel, but Begin was a fan of Jabotinsky, and Jabotinsky was not a communist. Jabotinsky was a bit more pro-freedom and pro-capitalism. So in 1977, Menachem Begin he was one of the leaders of the new Likud party, which is Bibi's party. And in 1977, this will get into some of the things I'll finish with. So he won the premiership, and he started taking Israel from socialist policies to free market policies. And today, the Israeli leaders like Netanyahu, Netanyahu might be a Lenin as far as like his fallacies regarding his Zionism, but when it comes to economics, he has an understanding of free markets. And as a matter of fact, he wrote a little blurb for Walter Block's. Walter Block, big free marketeer, he wrote a book making the liberal case for Israel, and Benjamin Netanyahu wrote a little foreword to it. And I don't know if, they invited Milei to give a speech at the Knesset in June of last year. So there's a lot of people in the Zionist government that are big free marketeers.
I noticed Ben Shapiro is always anti-tariff.
Yeah, he's good. He's good in economics. We got to give him that, right? Exactly. So it's very complex because today the Zionists, they used to be bad on everything, on the Zionism and the socialism. But after the Likud party, now they're good on freedom and capitalism, but obviously they're awful with their Zionism. But that's why the United States is overthrowing all of these socialist regimes. That's why we attacked Venezuela, because it really marries well with the Zionist ideology. You got to get rid of the socialists and the critics of Zionism, which is exactly what Venezuela is. But so anyway, now we can get into our little friends like Jake. And so I had this quote from, so Jake's friend, right? Dan Bilzerian, gutsy guy, right? I appreciate his courage. I appreciate how he brings attention to a lot of Zionist errors. But look what he said. He said, Jews should pay Holocaust reparations to the families of the 60 million Christians they killed during the Bolshevik genocide. To me, that's a mistake, right? Right? The Jews were overrepresented in there.
Yeah.
But how can you make them pay? That's
how is that going to make any situation any better?
Exactly.
How can you pin that on Jews? So just grouping all Jews together.
Exactly.
And even if you could, how is reparations going to make anything better to 60 million Christians? That's insane.
And just because a lot of these people, they don't even realize that most Jews in Russia were opposed to socialism. Just because you had an overrepresentation in the leadership doesn't mean that most Jews even went along with the communist nonsense. Most Jews were victims of the Bolshevik calamity.
Very capitalist.
Yeah, they were capitalist and they were religious. They loved their traditions. They loved their Judaism. And the Bolsheviks screwed them too. I have a friend, whose grandfather was killed by the Soviets. And, he was Jewish. He was sympathetic to Zionism and Stalin killed him or something like that. So this is a mistake. And then, unfortunately, he's out there. It's always the Jews. The Jews invented pornography. The Jews invented this, So many fallacies. And here I mentioned, the Kim.com, right? He created a poll. Do you want the Jews kicked out of America?
And that's what it was. Do you want them kicked out of America?
Exactly.
85% of respondents, right?
88.4, almost 85, said yes.
Said yes. That's going to help the situation.
Yeah, it's awful.
Like I said, in New York, they elected Mondami, who is staunchly anti-Zionist, and he carried the Jewish vote.
Well, I don't think Mondami is anti-Zionist. He's very critical of the current brand of Zionism, but I don't think he's like, remember.
No, right. He's like Josh Shapiro. He's a liberal.
Right. He's like, Netanyahu's the evil. He's
the right-leaning
people
are the bad guys.
The bad capitalist Jew.
I see.
But he's definitely not for like changing the Israeli state and changing into something else. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Regardless, they elected him, and,
yeah.
And it was he carried the Jewish vote.
Yeah, and that's a good sign. Again, the Jews want to make things better, but a lot of times they don't even know how to make things better because that thing is such a mess. And we'll finish that. We'll get to the Hayek letters soon. Important stuff. So anyway, what else? So now the naive Zionized mob would look at a poll like that and want to ban it, right? Because the Zionized mob, they're for banning everything, right? We got to look at the censorship, right? And even make criminals out of people who chose yes. I guarantee you that there's a bunch of Jews that would love to find out who said yes on that poll and make criminals out of them, right?
I would think so, yeah.
I would think so too, yeah. But, making the point, wise people understand and appreciate the ability to see how people really think. We got to respect freedom of speech, right? Even when they make mistakes or they say awful things. Like that, we can measure our progress. Like, I'm totally fine with this guy making this poll. I want to learn. If there's a lot of people who are making the mistake, who believe that the Jews should get kicked out of America, I don't want to silence them. I want to understand how people really think and be free to express their views, right?
It certainly seems better than putting them in jail.
Exactly, yeah. So again, anti-Jewish fallacies fuel Zionist ones and vice versa.
Vice versa, yes. So what should we do? Take all the people who responded yes on that poll and kick them out of the country? Would that be the solution?
No, we tell them about Mises and the solution. So now, but it's very important to realize, like, to understand, as I write here, to understand the seeming cruelty and negligence with which the Zionists keep mutilating civilization via the constant wars, the censorship towards the deemed anti-Semites, you only have to likewise understand the fallacies and the seeming cruelty and the negligence of the anti-Semites. That's the truth.
That is very fair. And it has been eye-opening for me recently, I must
Yeah.
admit.
When we see how cruel the anti-Semites can be, the things they say about the Jews, it makes perfect sense.
84% of the people who responded to that think Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro and his entire family should be kicked out of the United States.
How cruel is that? Yeah. So
I'd
again,
say.
and when you understand that we're all just equal human beings, it makes sense. If some people can be so cruel, there's a reason for it. And we gotta unravel it. Oh, so now let me. So these
Oh
are
my goodness. I
these
saw
are the
this already.
texts. So just yesterday, I think it was yesterday or the day before, some Jewish guy that was my Facebook friend. So one of the things that happened, so I'm friends with David Beito. David Beito is a professor who wrote a great book about FDR, and he's been trying to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So he wants to turn Palestine into something like Switzerland with a lot of little mini states or whatever. So one time he sent me a link to a group where there were a lot of Jews and Palestinians. It was one of these solidarity groups, right? And I'm always looking for friends that may be interested in solving this kind of mess. So I found this one Jewish guy, and we had a lot of common friends. And sometimes, you're looking for like-minded friends. So I friended him without knowing anything about him, right? So I friended the guy. So then a month goes by, and this guy, now I had no idea that he was like a hardcore Zionist, like super Zionist.
You should have. In hindsight, I looked at it, and
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
his profile pictures and stuff had
Yeah.
pictures of him saying I'm a Zionist. And
Yeah.
now that doesn't mean he's bad. So I love you,
course.
Jorge. I do. So that doesn't mean he's bad. So you wanted to see the best in him.
Exactly. I'm like, if we have a lot of common friends, I'm thinking, well, I'm looking for Zion. I want to
I see.
persuade Zionists.
Yeah.
So a couple of days ago, I get a message from him, and he's telling me, "Are you Jewish?" I'm like, "Oh no, I'm not Jewish." Oh, maybe I found you because I was looking for common friends or whatever. And then he goes into some crazy rant, and he tells me, he told me so many. He says, again, the Jewish community has to be careful. People like you might be taking our names to plan attacks. I'm just concerned that you might be planning an attack on a synagogue or similar place, considering your posts. Are you currently planning any attacks on a synagogue? This guy, out of the nowhere, tells me these things.
We thought maybe he was a bot at one point.
Yeah, at some point, I thought maybe he's one of these Ziobots. Surreal. And then he tells me, this went on forever. He says, I thought you were a neo-Nazi. I just thought maybe you were trying to get Jewish contacts. I assume you were documenting Jews to plan an attack on a synagogue, right? I see you are collecting Jewish contacts and names. I am wondering if you are trying to locate Jewish people for attacks. Remember, ADL CEO Jonathan Greenblatt says that anti-Zionism is genocide. So Jews like this find people who are critics of Zionism,
He believes
and he
that.
thinks, I want to genocide the Jews. This is
You want to harm Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro, is what he believes.
Exactly. So this is a sign of the chaos that we're headed. And before I get into this, just today, just a few hours ago, I have a Jewish friend on Facebook. I'm not going to say his name, but today he posted saying that he got some anti-Zionist, because he's a Zionist Jew, and some anti-Zionist harmed his family. They said that they wanted to harm him and his family or whatever, and he contacted the FBI. So again, this is awful, right? My Jewish Zionist friend is getting attacked and threatened by anti-Zionists, right? And I, who am critical of Zionism, I'm getting, attacked or harassed or very seriously vilified by Zionists. So we can see how the fallacies and the polarizations are spreading dangerous. stop. I mean, we're headed for like a calamity. And now, the police is about to come. And COVID mania was nothing compared to the anti-Semite mania that's about to hit. But let's keep moving here.
I just hope we can hold on to the First Amendment.
Oh, yeah. No, we need to, but it's about to like collapse. So this was...
That's the one thing I don't like you saying, Jorge, is when I hear you say that. You're Pollyanna in many cases, but then I hear this doomsday scenario playing out.
I mean, the truth is that, I mean, let's look at history. The First World War came. For 4 years. People ran across the trenches for reasons today nobody even remembers. I mean, the masses are so clueless. They work themselves into a calamity. We already discussed enough about the stupidity of the Second World War and how
but not many people accept that.
Yeah, not many people accept it, and we can clearly see it's repeating.
Yes.
Just the other day, Lindsey Graham, God, the most naive.
He's very rational.
Yeah. Lindsey Graham was talking about, Trump and Netanyahu are like Churchill and FDR fighting the forces of evil. It makes perfect sense to these clueless people.
Yeah, it's kind of true.
So when you really understand history, you can see that the same thing is repeating. If you're not going along with the war against the Iranians, you're a Hitler fan, you're an anti-Semite. It's repeating. We can clearly see it, but we're in a minority and somehow we got to make a difference. But this is a good quote showing, like, this was a few years ago already, 2022. So Khomeini, the former Iranian leader, he mentioned the Western powers are a mafia. The reality of this power is a mafia. At the top of this mafia stand the prominent Zionist merchants, and the politicians obey them. The U.S. is their showcase, and they're spread out everywhere. To me, that is a mistake. It is true that Zionist ideologues have immense, it's become sadly, it's become almost the religion of America, Zionism. But it's a mistake to say that somehow they're like some purposeful mafia. And notice how he said merchants, Zionist merchants. Merchants are good, So, I mean, when you look at Khomeini's post, there's a lot of wisdom, in a lot of things he posts. But sometimes you also get this kind of things like we're for the morality and the Jews are spreading immorality, and this sort of stuff. So you can see a little bit of the fallacies. And then this is Deborah Lipstadt. She used to be the head of the anti-Semitism, bureaucracy that we have, right? And she tweeted, she said, "We denounce this continued egregious anti-Semitism. This rhetoric is unacceptable, not to mention dangerous, especially from the head of a state. It must cease." So we can see, the fallacies a little bit and the back and forth. Again, why is it that, I mean, I forgot it. I gotta find it here because I really need to mention this quote. Well, we can always.
We need to do another episode like this.
Yeah.
We will do.
Yeah,
another
but we're almost
episode.
done here. Actually, at least for this episode, we're almost done here.
You think we've solved the world's problems? How many people are going to listen to this whole episode? Do you think? Not the most popular. The people on the anti-Zionist side probably want us to be a little harder on the Zionists, and then vice versa, right? It's not the most popular.
Yeah. But so Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, right? He mentioned, quote, "Hamas and Hezbollah are proxies of Iran, and they're tied now with Russia and China. I mean, it's a new axis of evil." And sadly, this is the new polarization of the whole planet, right? This is where the good versus evil comes from. The entire planet is divided along Zionist lines. That's all there's to it. Why is Putin treated like the next Hitler? Because Putin treats the Iranians as fellow human beings with real concerns, who really believe that the Palestinians need to be treated better. That Zionists, unfortunately, the Iranians, you see, I see Zionism as a mistake. The Iranians see it as the result of malicious Jews. And there's a big difference, right? And this is very important because the same thing happened in the Soviet Union. Remember, the Soviet Union, the Soviet ideologues, they were killing all the Christians, all the Muslims, all the Jews, destroying all the mosques. They killed like 80,000 priests. Russia had about 29,000 Christian Orthodox churches in 1927. By 1940, it only had like 600.
Jeez.
Okay. So the Bolsheviks were killing all the religious people. Unfortunately, I mean, I wish it were different. The priests that were getting destroyed by the Bolsheviks, they were calling the Bolsheviks satanic. You guys are evil guys. But the Bolsheviks, they didn't care about religion. They thought they had good intentions. We're for the science. We got chess players. You know, so that only intensified, right? You have to overcome the fallacies, and sadly, we see a lot of that. Because again, I am critical of Zionism. But when I run into some Palestinians that they just hate Israel. The Israelis are satanic. So anyway, you can see here that this is the reason why Putin is seen as the next Hitler. Putin treats the Iranians as people concerned, with certain things and so on. I think Russia still recognizes the Golan Heights as land belonging to Syria. According to the UN. And so on. So the Russians, and remember, the Russians traditionally, even from the days of the Soviet Union, they had more cordial relations with the Arab states. So that has carried over. The Russian government is far more, they treat the Palestinians a lot better than the Israelis. So what does that mean? That means that Putin is the next Hitler. I mean, that's all there's to it. That's where the Putin is the next Hitler mentality comes from. And that's why when Tucker Carlson went to Russia,
That was a big deal.
Yeah, you're sitting with Hitler.
Do you think Tucker Carlson's getting ready to go to prison?
Very complex. I mean, this is like, I think he's ready, and it's coming. The mob, just like the mob pushed us into World War II, we're seeing it right now. And it's almost good that this is happening, because we need enough Americans to wake up, to understand the fallacies.
I've been critical of Tucker in the past. If he goes to prison for his free speech,
oh yeah,
he will be a hero. I mean, there's no way around that.
Oh yeah, major hero. Now, I do think Tucker sometimes makes mistakes.
Sure.
I do think he makes mistakes, and those mistakes bring on the anti-Semite label, just like Candace. She makes mistakes. I mean, for Candace to tell Netanyahu that he's run by satanic forces, that brings,
some of the stuff Candace says about, stories from 100 years ago of Jews and bad things happening, and it's focusing. You can do the same with Christians.
Exactly.
It doesn't sound too crazy to us, but to many Christians, to hear that is like, what do you mean, Christians? No, but if you take a critical look at Christians, you can find all sorts of horrible examples of humanity. I mean, there's like no shortage of absolutely inhumane things that you can point to.
Yeah, again, it's so obvious when you realize that we're all equally human, right? So anyway, that slide, we're almost done. I mean, so Zionism, one of the things about socialism is that socialism was universal in nature. Anybody could be a socialist. So we had socialist revolutions in China, in Cuba, all over the world, right? So the ideology took people of all faiths, I mean, not all faiths, sorry, the communists were atheists, of all backgrounds, of all ethnicities, to the top. But Zionism is mostly of concern to Jews. So little by little, Zionism keeps moving to the top the people who are Jewish, just because that is the ideology that is becoming very important, right? I mean, am I making sense? Like, if this is an important ideology in socialism, since it appeals to anyone, anybody can rise to the top. But Zionism is more of a concern to Jews. So it makes sense that the Jews rise to the top in a Zionized world. And today, Anthony Blinken, I mean, everybody knows that behind the scenes, I mean, you got a dead Biden, he's dead, pretty much. You got Blinken, all these things.
Is that Blinken there with
the mask? With Zelensky.
Yes.
Yeah. What a coincidence that the guy in Ukraine who is having a war against Russia happens to be a Zionist Jew. I mean, what a coincidence. I mean, it's not a plot. It's not a conspiracy. Little by little, remember what I mentioned earlier about George Carlin, right? And statistics. When you have a shared ideology, right? When you have to fight the anti-Semites, right? Who's going to rise to the top in an environment where you have to criticize the anti-Semites? It's the Jews, because it makes more sense to them. So little by little, you have more and more positions of power. The more Zionism you have, the more you inevitably push Jews to the top. And it's not the result of a conspiracy. It's just baked into the ideology. And look at this. I mean, you can mediate between countries, but not between good and evil.
Oh my God! Anybody who believes shit like that, but a lot of people do. I do.
Especially the Zionized Jews, because they live in a world of.
But I think a lot of Americans fall entirely for that too.
Oh yeah.
The good and evil thing.
Yeah.
I think that's a very manipulated thing.
So we're getting close to the end here, at least as far as like this, and then we can, wrap it up by talking about all kinds of things. But so I wanted to finish by so this is a little article that I published. It turns out, so for example, Murray Rothbard, okay, who is one of the greatest, Austrians, one of the great, economists. Murray Rothbard has, even though he's Jewish, right, he has always known that Zionism was a major error. He wrote a classic essay called "War Guilt in the Middle East," written very soon after the 1967 Six-Day War, right? So if you look at the history of Israel,
I read that,
right?
actually. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. There was the War of Independence, right, 1948, where so at the end of the First World War, the British took over Palestine, and they started having a lot of migration of Jews, so there was all kinds of chaos and so on. At some point, the British had like 100,000 troops in Palestine, and it was costing them a fortune, right? So they say, okay, we're washing our hands out of this. We're getting the fuck out of here. We're getting back to England. It's too expensive. We're going to turn this whole mess over to the UN. And then the UN started thinking about what we could do or whatever. And then one day, they had just like a little proposal. They said, it wasn't even a binding resolution or anything like that. It was just one recommendation. They said, well, maybe we can put 55% of the land. We can give it to the Jews or whatever. And the other, I forgot what the split was or whatever. And but by that time, once the British left, right, and once they voted for these things, and the Jews tried to get the vote to go or whatever. So anyway, a lot of the Jews, they said, oh, no, this is like an official mandate. And now they have given us a country. It's just a whole mess. Basically, 1948, as the British withdrew, right, there was a little mini civil war, right? And as a result of the 1948 little mini civil war, 700,000 Palestinians got expelled, right? And they were not allowed to return home after the war fighting ended, right? So that was, the beginning of what the Palestinians called the Nakba, the great, calamity or whatever. But then in 1967, there was the so-called Six-Day War, right? When the Israelis, saying that the armies were about to attack them, they went preemptively on the offensive. And now they conquered sort of like the West Bank, East Jerusalem. They took over that, and they started to control all these things or whatever. So anyway, soon after that war, Murray Rothbard wrote that article, War Guilt in the Middle East, basically brilliantly summarizing everything we have talked about. Very good article. And Murray Rothbard finishes the article very wisely. He says, look, man, like the Israelis are always going to be surrounded by people who hate their gods. Sooner or later, they need to just become citizens of the Middle East like they used to be when they had, prosperity or whatever. So anyway, the point I want to make is that Murray Rothbard, everybody knows, has always been a major critic of Zionism. Long time ago. But very recently, I learned that Friedrich Hayek, because in the world of Austrian economics, the two biggest descendants of Mises, Mises was like total badass. You could say that he had two little offspring, Hayek and Rothbard, but it turns out that Friedrich Hayek, right? Friedrich Hayek tried to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the late 70s and early 80s. And it turns out that it was during a time when there was a huge war in Lebanon, just like we have right now. Right now, the Israelis are attacking Lebanon, right? So Hayek was like, look, we need to turn this into some kind of federation, right? We need to create a new little country. We'll call it the Levantine, the Levant. You heard of the Levant, right? Mm-hmm. The Levant is another name for that area, that includes Palestine and Syria and Jordan and all that. So it was a good idea. At the beginning, Hayek called it the Palestine Federation. He wanted to have like a little federal government with like little states, just like the United States has many states, right? That's pretty much what Hayek wanted. A federation with little states, and hopefully people would have the freedom to live anywhere, and we have a free trade, and it could become a beacon of progress to the world. Brilliant. So Hayek sent this stuff in letters. He sent a letter to Menachem Begin. Begin didn't like reply. Hayek sent another letter.
Really?
Yeah, or something like that. He was kind of like ignored. He finally gets a letter back. Oh, thank you for your advice. He gets ignored. He sent a letter to Moshe Dayan. Moshe Dayan was a very famous Israeli general. He sent a big letter to Moshe Dayan. And unfortunately, Moshe Dayan died soon after he got the letter. So then Hayek tries again. He sends a letter to the mayor of Jerusalem, explaining things. Guys, do this or whatever. He gets ignored. They send him back a little letter. They're politicians. It's almost like dealing with communists. You're telling them, please make a difference. Look at these books. Change your ways. But these are Zionist ideologues. They totally neglected Hayek, right? So then Hayek, after trying, he gives up pretty much. And he finally goes public and he sends a little letter to the Times of London, right? And we can look at the letter now because it's very short. Look what Hayek says. Hayek says, and what a coincidence that right now we're having a war in Lebanon. Hayek says, sir, the desperate position of Lebanon suggests to me that I ought to urge publicly what I have many times vainly urged on Israeli friends, namely that Israel could make no greater contribution to the safety of its own future and to the peace of the world than by offering Jerusalem as a common capital of a Palestine federation on the principle of like a Washington in the District of Columbia, something similar. This would amount, at least at first, to little more than common defense and a free trade union within which self-governing cultural communities would learn peacefully to collaborate for their several aims. In this case, the federal capital clearly ought to be also the seat of the government of the several states. So he wanted to turn Jerusalem, into like the capital of this little kumbaya, little new country called something like that, right? But of course, Hayek got totally neglected. And notice how he says, for the peace, to the peace of the world. And look where we are today.
Not so much.
Yeah. So the Austrians, right? The Austrians predicted, they did the most to show that communism was a failure. And the greatest Austrians, Murray Rothbard and Friedrich Hayek, knew that the current Zionist state, as it currently works, was also a calamity. And they tried to fix it. But just like the communists were negligent bureaucrats, and they kept the bullshit going for like 70 years, right now we're dealing with a bunch of clueless, negligent Zionist ideologues that are just as sort of clueless. And yeah, that was the last slide. So now if you want to talk about anything,
I'm back.
Actually, there's a couple of quick little things I want to finish up here.
Okay.
Let me mention a couple of other so let's quickly get back to our list of anti-Semitic fallacies. There's a couple of more that I just want to run real quick.
Okay.
So, for example, there's a Jewish overrepresentation in pornography, right? And LGBT and that kind of stuff. So, why does that happen? You see, since the Jews, a lot of them became more secularized, right? If you're more secularized and you're more Darwinian, it's understandable how you're going to be more tolerant of like human nature and pornography and things like that. If you have more secular people and you do not have a moral code that's telling you that some of these things are bad, inadvertently, not as a result of anything tied to your Jewish genes or anything like that, you're going to be more tolerant of things like pornography. That just comes with being more secular, right? Do you see that?
Oh, certainly. That makes sense. And I'm raised Irish Catholic family. I think it's easy for people to quickly jump on the moral high horse of judging others. for those types of things, and
Yeah,
opportunity presents itself in business and things like that. And certainly if you take the religious element out, you can see where human beings kind of tend toward that direction, and there's a market for it. So
exactly. So if a lot of them statistically end up being more secular or more tolerant of these things, it makes sense that they're going to be overrepresented in that.
that makes
But
sense.
again, it's just part of being secular or whatever. It has nothing to do with being Jewish.
It's not a
To do
Jewish conspiracy.
exactly, and it's not tied to their genes or their race or their culture. Yeah. So same thing with LGBT stuff. And I think there was an article that I read once that said that Tel Aviv may be the gay capital of the world because
Mhm.
you know, and now this carries over to Hollywood. It's understandable that Jews were pushed into certain industries, and if they're more tolerant of certain things, they also have an overrepresentation, you know, in Hollywood. And it also translates to ideological movements that deviate from our religious traditions. Like Candace Owens loves to talk about Freud and
Yeah, that's what I mean.
psychoanalysis,
Yes,
right? But
pedophilia.
well, that too, I guess. Again, if
But
you are
she does when she talks about Freud and the people who are associated with Freud, and she makes a lot of pedophilic connections, and it certainly sounds conspiratorial.
right, but again, it's the result of having proportionally more people that are more likely to discard morality that looks at those things badly.
Our one friend that we referred to would say that you're apologizing for the Zionists.
No, I'm definitely not apologizing for
That's
anything.
what he would say. So you get it on both sides, right?
Yeah, you know what I mean. I'm just trying to
I do
show
know
why.
what you mean. I do.
Right.
It's human nature. We're all human, and to truly take a mirror and look back at your group and say, hey, if we were presented with these opportunities and absent of the religious Alan Dershowitz, we don't think he's a religious Jew, do we?
I, I don't know if I mentioned that earlier, but Alan Dershowitz, there's another great example with Alan Dershowitz, because Alan Dershowitz is on the record, like he's one of the people who believes that the laws of consent, the age of consent should be lowered to like 15 years old or 14 years old. And to
Mm-hmm.
me, that is representative of the point I'm trying to make.
Sure.
Dershowitz is another one of these secular,
Certainly secular Jew.
exactly. He's
You
another
think
secular.
Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro, the most Jewish religious Jew that you and I know, do you think what would he say if we asked him if he thought Alan Dershowitz was a living embodiment of Judaism? He would laugh.
He would laugh, but remember, like, oh no, yeah. I mean, he's not like he would. I don't think he would define him as a Jew, because Jew, you have to be religious.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah. I love Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro because he questions so many of those things. He questions the entire notion that Judaism is a race,
Right.
and that Hebrew language is that they reintroduced it after it was dead for thousands of years. Why did they do that? So I mean, Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro is just so on the money with so many things. It's amazing.
Yeah. So anyway, so I'm glad we briefly just touched up on this ones, because it's very
Those are
important, right?
important.
This leads to a lot of fallacies. Candace blaming pornography on the Jews and all this stuff. There's massive fallacies. She needs to realize that if the Jews are overrepresented in these things, it's due to complex factors, not it's because the Jews.
Yes.
You know,
And it's counterproductive
it's
entirely.
counterproductive, right?
Like when you and I both are a fan of Carrie Prejean Bowler. Okay. However, when she was on the stand in that Religious Liberties Commission, I forget, was it Jonathan Greenblatt, or it was maybe the guy from the satire website? What's it called? Anyways, they were asking her on the stand there at the Religious Liberties Commission, do you think Candace Owens is an anti-Semite? And she said, no, I don't. I'm okay with that answer. I don't think Candace Owens is actually, super anti-Semitic. But then they said, has she ever said anything that sounds anti-Semitic to you? And Carrie Prejean Bowler, who I'm a big fan of, she said no.
Oh,
That was a fumble, in my opinion.
yeah. And that reminds me again. This gets back to the original Mises quote about how it's all about ideas. Like it's very important to see, like, people make anti-Semitic fallacies. They make anti-Jewish fallacies. But just because somebody makes an anti-Jewish fallacy, to then say that they are an anti-Semite,
Yes.
you're
That's why
taking
I
a
would say I don't think that Candace Owens is actually an anti-Semite.
right.
She's connecting some dots that sound horrible
Right.
and do not contribute to the cause very well
Yeah.
at times.
Yeah.
But
No,
I
but
don't think that she would have voted. Would she have voted yes, you
oh, of
think,
course not. Of course not on
I
that
don't,
on expect right.
on expelling the Jews from the United
Of course
States?
not.
I don't think so. I really don't, because
Right. Yeah.
she's friends with Dave Smith. And,
Of
I mean, I
course. Yeah.
think to vote yes on that poll, that's pretty bad.
Yeah. But again, like, to me, it's important that even when people make anti-Semitic fallacies, they're human beings. There are ideas that enter their mind that lead them to have such erroneous views.
Sure.
We do not want to just label them something and then automatically make criminals out of them, even if they
100%.
have, even if they have bad ideas. The only thing we really need for people who really understand freedom and economics is respect for private property. If someone has horrible views, you can be the most hardcore anti-Semite or racist or whatever you want.
Or
If you do not harm,
anti-Muslim.
or anti-Muslim or whatever, if you do not harm another, if you're civilized enough to not harm other people and their property, you have met all the requirements that are needed to have a prosperous society.
And
And
over
again,
time, through coexistence and things, that those relations do just get better. They do.
yeah, and you are, by doing that, you are also supporting the competition of ideas that will eventually help you overcome your fallacies. And even if you don't overcome the fallacies, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with living a life with some errors. Again, but what we don't want to do is start harming people just because some bad ideas make sense to them.
Kick them out or put them in jail for ideas, or
Of course. Yeah. And then a couple more, actually, a couple. So now, so because very quickly, so we talked about a lot of the anti-Semitic fallacies, right? But now let's quickly go over 3 Zionist fallacies, 3 very prominent error that the Zionists make. Number 1, of course, is seeing Zionism as a means to overcome anti-Semitism, right? You can only overcome anti-Semitism through reason, logic, sympathy for the misguided, and education, right? Asking the Jews to leave Europe, right? To coerce this bullshit, Herzl design bullshit monstrosity,
secular state.
Exactly. It's a recipe for chaos, as 130 years of history has shown us. The second one is, now, this overabundance, like a lot of the Zionists, especially the secular left-wing Zionists, right? They think that they are like a beacon of Western values and reason, and we have equal rights for women, and we follow the science. We have statistically the highest number of Nobel Laureates, and we have so many researchers and doctors, and we are a beacon of Western civilization, right? They think that they are like the beacon of Western civilization, right? And they can always fool themselves into thinking that justifies their Zionism, just because they might find a lot of pissed off, very angry Muslims that may say anti-Semitic things, right? So they fool themselves, right? It's good to have equal rights for women, little democracy. They fool themselves into thinking that just because they do have some aspects of Western civilization that a lot of people think are better than some other things, they fool themselves into thinking that somehow that makes them better, and that makes Zionism like the better thing, right? They're always, a lot of times you argue with a Zionist and they say, oh, but which society would you rather live? Who has more rights, right? Who is more advanced, right? But in that sense, they're making the same error than the Soviets made, right? The Soviets had the chess champions, with the exception of Bobby Fischer and some Danish guy. They
Bobby
had,
Fischer, who's
who's a big critic of the Jews,
yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah. They also had Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space. Now I can tell you, because I mean, I was born in communism. Every good little communist knows who Yuri Gagarin is. He's the great hero of every young little communist like I was.
My wife tells me about that, is how that it was presented like they won the space race.
Exactly. So just like the Soviets were constantly looking to make themselves look like they were at the vanguard in civilization, just because they had the chess champions, a lot of, the gymnastics, they were doing good there, and they put the first man in space. That further helped them fool themselves. While in reality, they were still pushing the most dangerous ideology at the time. So we can see the same pattern happening, especially with the more left-wing Zionists, right? Because we got the science, and all this stuff, and we're secular, we're for equal rights. So they fool themselves in that way, and they're making that, that same error. And then the last one I'll quickly throw in there is that you have a lot of these people who think that somehow Judaism and Zionism, like it's almost as if they invented Western civilization, right? Just because the God of Abraham, and out of Judaism, the truth is, like, when you understand Menger and you understand that civilization is the result of a little trial and error of many cultures. You had the Romans. I mean, think about the Islamic world. Why do we use the Arabic numerals, right? Because the Muslims, for like 200 years, they were the leading businessmen. They were the leading scientists, and they created number system that was ideally made for doing business and profit and loss calculation, right? But you have a lot these days. You have a lot of these Zionists. You have a lot of these Jews that somehow think that the world, that they invented Western civilization. This is very prominent among a lot of these naive Zionists, and they think, how many people now, like, how many of these leaders, Lindsey Graham, all of these people have now fooled themselves into thinking that Zionism equates civilization. And if you don't support Zionism, you're for the barbarians. Exactly. So that is a major fallacy, to fool themselves into that. And it's very easy for them to do it, because the Zionists, they do have a lot of very smart people. We all have Jewish friends, who support Israel, and they're some of the most educated people around. Most of my Jewish friends are they're very well read, very serious. But again, just like the Soviets, just because you're very educated and all this does not mean that your ideology is not inadvertently, destroying civilization.
Oftentimes it's the contrary.
Yeah.
The more educated, sometimes the more misguided, sometimes ideologically.
Yeah, I mean, but it's very easy once you understand private property, freedom. If you're defending that, so I think to myself, the Jews, they fool themselves into communism, they fool themselves into Zionism, and hopefully they finally fool themselves into freedom, into capitalism, right?
And they follow the Jews like Murray Rothbard, Mises,
Exactly.
so many greats.
Yeah.
Good stuff, Jorge. Thank you very much for coming on. I always appreciate your time. I think this sets the record for our longest episode.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks a lot. It was a lot of fun. And, now we have more to expand on and hopefully do other entertaining things.
I love it. Well, thank you very much, Jorge. I want to say thank you to everyone for tuning in. Jorge, before we wrap things up, Besada.com, what else?
Yeah. Besada.com, and follow me on Twitter, Hayekian, @Hayekian. Yep.
I love it. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. We'll have another episode out soon. Thank you.